Mark Hobson was born on the 2nd of September 1969 in Wakefield, West Yorkshire in the UK. Hobson's childhood was described by friends as, quote, happy and stable, and he grew up with his parents Peter and Sandra and his two sisters Melanie and Leslie. The family eventually moved to Selby, North Yorkshire. However, despite apparently there being no issues in his childhood, Hobson soon began displaying extreme violence towards others, including in 1990 when he viciously attacked a girlfriend. In 1991, Hobson moved in with his childhood sweetheart Kay and her two children. The pair had a daughter together and married in 1993. Hobson worked at various jobs, including a landscape gardener and as a nightclub doorman in 1998. Hobson then, without any warning, informed Kay that he was leaving the marriage, and on the 1st of January 1999, he simply walked out of the family home. Kay later said, quote, there was no one else involved. He just didn't want married life anymore. It was bizarre. I couldn't believe it. He turned to pot and drinking heavily. He never drank when we were married, but now he got off his face. He became like a zombie. His life just went completely off the rails. Hobson's life indeed went off the rails, and he spent the next few years floating around, and his alcohol use and use of drugs, particularly cannabis, increased. Hobson was apparently soon drinking approximately 35 cans of strong beer a day. In March 2002, a man called William Brace was walking through Selby town centre when, across the road, he spotted his ex-girlfriend with Hobson. William was not too happy about this, his ex-girlfriend and his friend now going out, and so he went across the road to confront them. As he approached, William felt a pain in his stomach and believed that Hobson had punched him. However, when he noticed the blood, he realised he'd been stabbed. In quick succession, Hobson stabbed William a further 5 times in broad daylight in front of shocked passers-by. He used a box cutter that he'd taken from his place of work in a factory. William lay bleeding in the street, and Hobson was apparently enjoying watching him bleed to death. Despite significant blood loss and a punctured lung, William survived. Hobson was arrested and ended up in court, where he admitted to wounding with intent to cause grievous bodily harm. In the UK, this is a serious offence, one step down from attempted murder. So you had an unprovoked attack with multiple stab wounds in broad daylight in front of numerous witnesses, and Hobson's punishment was, brace yourself, a 2-year probation order and 100 hours of community service. Mark Hobson should have received a significant custodial sentence for this incident, and had he would have been safely behind bars, and none of the horror that was about to take place would have happened. Claire Sanderson was aged 26 when she met Hobson, when they worked together at the same packaging plant in Selby in 2003. She had a twin sister called Diane. Claire and Hobson shared a mutual love of Tracy Chapman records and drinking, and they quickly became a couple, with people stating that Claire was, quote, smitten with Hobson. By April 2003, Claire had convinced her parents to lend her money for a deposit for a flat, and her and Hobson moved in together. However, Hobson began to demonstrate extreme violence towards Claire almost immediately, and he didn't care who saw what he was doing. On one occasion, a local man dragged Hobson off Claire when he was physically stood on her whilst holding a 12-inch butcher's knife to her neck. On another occasion, Hobson was seen punching Claire repeatedly in the face whilst holding her around the neck. Over the next year, Claire was the victim of repeated acts of violence, which resulted in the police being called on repeated occasions, but she appeared to be unable to give up on Hobson, with people stating that she, quote, followed him around like a lapdog. By the beginning of July 2004, Hobson was telling friends that he, quote, chose the wrong sister, and that he was going to, quote, have Claire's twin sister Diane. On Sunday, the 11th of July 2004, Hobson put his plan to remove Claire and pursue Diane into action. In the evening of this day, Claire and Hobson spent time drinking in a pub before going back to their flat. When they returned, Hobson attacked Claire, hitting her 17 times in the head with a hammer, killing her. He then wrapped her body in bin bags and hid it in their bedroom. Claire's family noticed her absence quickly, and Hobson began stalling for time, telling them that Claire was sick or out visiting friends, but they were clearly becoming concerned. Little did they know that Hobson was planning his next murder and was reading survival manuals, anticipating that, when he was finished, he would need to go on the run. On the 17th of July 2004, 6 days after killing Claire, Hobson called her twin sister Diane and told her that Claire had glandular fever and was too ill to talk, but wanted her to visit. Diane left the home she shared with her mother and father and eagerly turned up. At 7:30 p.m, she stepped over the threshold into the flat, not knowing that her sister's body was wrapped in bin bags just up the stairs. Hobson then attacked her and, after hog-tying her, tortured her with scissors and razor blades to cut and stab her, including mutilating her genitals. She was also sexually assaulted, and he bit off her left nipple, which is believed that he swallowed. Hobson placed a bag over Diane's head and repeatedly beat her with a hammer. Eventually, Hobson strangled Diane to death. He then wrapped her body in bin bags and lay it next to that of her sister, whose body by now was starting to decompose. Diane's death was noticed almost immediately, as, after visiting her sister, she was meant to be going to meet her boyfriend at the pub. At approximately 8:45 p.m, the boyfriend, Ian Harrison, called Diane's mobile to find out where she was. Hobson answered the phone and made up a story that Claire and Diane's father, George Sanderson, had had a heart attack, so they had both rushed to be by his bedside. Ian was actually an old friend of Hobson's, so the pair arranged to meet at the pub instead. Hobson turned up, and he's described as being calm and showing absolutely no sign that he just viciously murdered Ian's girlfriend and now had 2 bodies in his bedroom. Remarkably, Hobson actually invited Ian to come back to the property. Why is unclear. Potentially he was intending to murder him, although he didn't eventually do this. When Ian turned up, he noticed an odd smell, which was the smell of Claire's decomposing body, which Hobson said was the drains, and he spotted blood on the sofa, which Hobson said was due to Claire's, quote, woman's problems. Hobson even invited Ian to stay the night, which he refused. When Ian used the toilet, Hobson stood behind him, and it was only later that Ian realised why, as this was to stop him from going into the bedroom, the room opposite, where the 2 bodies were lying on the floor. Ian went home, and by 7 a.m. the next morning, the 18th of July, he had still not heard from Diane and was beginning to worry. He went round to Diane's house, and when her father George opened the door in perfect health, he knew something was wrong. Ian and George went to Hobson's flat and forced entry. There, they found the mutilated and abused bodies of both women, but no sign of Hobson, who, by this point, had fled. The police were called, and they found evidence almost straight away which showed that the murders were premeditated, with them recovering a, quote, to-do list in the property. On it was a shopping list of items, including bin bags, duct tape, cable ties, fly spray, and air freshener, as well as a plan to lure Diane to the property, with, quote, use and abuse at will, being written by her name. Also written was a list of targets, including Diane and Claire's parents, as well as his ex-wife Kay. It was obvious who committed the murders, and the police began looking for Hobson, but unfortunately, by this point, he had already murdered 2 more people. After Ian had left the flat in the late evening of the 17th of July 2004, Hobson called his mother and claimed that, rather than being dead and their bodies wrapped up in the bedroom, Diane and Claire had been in a road traffic accident and had been badly injured and taken to hospital. Hobson asked for a lift to the hospital, which was in York. Hobson's mother picked him up and drove him the 15 miles to the hospital, arriving at around 2 a.m. on the 18th of July 2004. She then sat in the car park and Hobson went in. He returned a short time later and told his mother that the sisters were receiving treatment and that he was going to stay. Hobson's mother then drove off and assumed that her son would make his own way back later. Why Hobson went through this pantomime is unclear. I assume it was to get out of the area without alerting his mother, but why did he want to go to this area specifically? We will never know. We also don't know what he did for the next few hours, but what we do know is that he travelled on foot to a small village called Strensall, which is about 6 miles away from the hospital. Living there were James Britton, aged 80, and his wife Joan, aged 81, a couple who'd been married for over 50 years and were enjoying their twilight years together. James had a condition similar to Parkinson's disease and was deaf and walked with a stick. Joan is described as being even more frail, and she too walked with a stick. At 8:55 a.m. on the 18th of July 2004, neighbours of the Brittons popped in to check on them and then left. Sometime between 9 a.m. and 11 a.m, Hobson broke into the property and attacked both James and Joan, beating them both with their own walking sticks. He then stabbed both of them. In the case of Joan, Hobson knocked her to the ground and stabbed her with such force that the blade went through her body and stuck in the floor underneath her. The blade then snapped off, so she was found in this state, the blade and the knife still in her body, when at 11:15 a.m, a neighbour again came to check on the couple and found a scene of absolute horror. The home had been ransacked, apparently due to Hobson looking for money. Hobson had made no real attempts to cover his tracks, and his fingerprints were found all over the property, including in the couple's blood. Police quickly attended and connected both crime scenes, and Mark Hobson became Britain's most wanted man. Police quickly began running through the list of places that Hobson could have gone to ground, including his friends and family. What they didn't know was that Hobson was hiding out in some fields, approximately 5 miles outside of the outskirts of York, in a village called Shipton by Benningborough, apparently using the survival skills that he'd learned from various books he'd read. However, he was clearly no Bear Grylls, as Hobson soon ran out of water, and a week after the murders of James and Joan Britton, on the 25th of July 2004, Hobson walked into a petrol station to buy matches, cigarette papers, and a bottle of water. He was instantly recognised by staff at the petrol station, and the police were called. Armed police swarmed the area, and within minutes, Hobson was arrested. As he was led away, Hobson said to the police, quote, "I'm a fucking murderer, aren't I?" Mark Hobson admitted all 4 killings at court, and, on the 25th of May 2005, appeared for sentencing at Leeds Crown Court before Mr. Justice Grigson. Justice Grigson said, quote, "The enormity of what you've done is beyond words, and quote, the damage you've done is incalculable. You have not only destroyed the lives of your victims, but you devastated the lives of those who loved them." Mark Hobson appeared to show no remorse for his actions. He then sentenced him. Mark Hobson was jailed for life and given a whole life tariff, meaning that he will never be released. In November 2005, Hobson appealed his sentence to the Court of Appeal, stating he should have got some credit for admitting to the murders at the first opportunity and not putting their families through the ordeal of a trial. This appeal was refused. Mark Hobson started his life in the town of Wakefield, and his life has come full circle, with him being sent to HMP Wakefield, a Category A prison I've mentioned on several occasions, as it's where the most dangerous criminals in the UK are held, and is dubbed the, quote, Monster Mansion. Hobson's guilty plea meant that he didn't have to give an explanation for his crimes in court. However, in 2006, it was revealed that Hobson had begun writing to a former friend, called Donna Kempt, with her saying, quote, "He doesn't like to dwell on the past, but he said that he and Claire rowed on the day he killed her, and he flipped, and he went on to murder them all. It was the booze more than the drugs which sent him over the edge." Hobson reportedly told Donna, quote, "At first I couldn't remember what had happened. Now the memories are coming back, and they do haunt me." Hobson also boasted about how he'd passed his GCSE and A-level in maths, and quipped that one day he would have, quote, "more qualifications than Stephen Hawking." In response to these revelations, Ian Harrison, Diane's partner, stated, quote, "It doesn't matter how many qualifications he gets, he'll never be able to use them. He's never going to be released, and that is it. When he launched his appeal, that really set me back, but now at least I know he'll rot in jail, and when he's dead, he'll rot in hell." George Sanderson, Claire and Diane's father, stated, quote, "It doesn't matter what Hobson says, he's just pure evil. Alcohol doesn't make you do what he did. It's because he's such a twisted person. He can never say sorry to us. We can't even look at our daughter's photographs without thinking about what he did. It's too hard to even talk about it, and whatever he said won't make any difference." Almost 20 years after this horrific quadruple murder, Mark Hobson remains in prison, where he'll spend the rest of his miserable existence. When I was looking into Mark Hobson, I didn't find any indicators of abuse when he was growing up or exposure to violence. These are often factors which result in people developing pro-violent attitudes, which they then display later in their lives. However, just because it isn't obviously written somewhere doesn't mean it didn't happen, as there's likely some reason why Hobson developed to the monster he did, or perhaps he was simply born evil. However, what is clear is that he was trying to excuse his behaviour by saying, "The alcohol made me do it." George Sanderson hit the nail on the head when he said alcohol didn't make him do it, he was just a twisted person, and that's correct. Alcohol and drugs don't create violence, or everyone who used them would start acting in that way. Alcohol and drugs just lower people's inhibitions and allows them to more easily act on their pre-existing violent and aggressive attitudes. Hobson blaming his alcohol and drug use makes no sense. Okay, maybe he was under the influence when he killed Claire, but he planned the death of Diane and had thought through what he needed to conceal their bodies and stop the smell of decay. Instead, I think that Mark Hobson was a man who saw others merely as objects he could use and abuse, and when he got tired of them, he felt the right to simply dispose of them. With regards to Claire, Hobson clearly thought that she was his property, something he could victimize any way he wanted, and this included abusing her in the street in full view of members of the public. He believed that he picked the wrong sister, so rather than leaving Claire and potentially trying to begin a relationship with Diane, as a normal person might do, he decided to get rid of Claire entirely and kill her, like one would dispose of an item they no longer have a use for. However, Hobson wasn't interested in any sort of mutual relationship with Diane. He just wanted to use and abuse her, before again disposing of her like rubbish. I believe what likely happened was that Diane attended the property, Hobson tried to initiate some sort of sexual contact, she rejected him, and he decided that she needed to die. The deaths of James and Joan Britton were completely gratuitous. Both individuals were elderly, and if Hobson's intention was just to rob them, he could simply have threatened them and got what he wanted. Potentially because of their level of vulnerability, he could have just walked in and taken what he wanted, and walked out, knowing full well they couldn't fight back. However, I think he saw two vulnerable people that he could use and abuse, and that he killed them for kicks. He knew that, when he was caught, he'd be going to prison forever, so thought he would just cause as much chaos as possible. Mark Hobson is just a cowardly, evil man who has no consideration for the life of anyone else. Potentially he is haunted by what he's done, and I hope that's the case, and I hope that he ends his life behind the confines of prison walls. Just a quick addition. I outlined the behaviours and motivations of domestic abuse perpetrators in my video about the horrific murder of Kellyanne Bates. Check out that video if you have time. In that video, I outlined how domestic abuse perpetrators are ultimately motivated by gaining and maintaining power and control over their victims using various tactics including violence, threats of violence, verbal abuse, etc. The case of Hobson raises another major warning flag in domestic abuse cases, and that is men who abuse their partners in full view of others, whether this be members of the family or members of the public. Often, domestic abuse perpetrators will try to hide their behaviour, knowing that if they're seen, someone will intervene. So there is ultimately some semblance within them that they know what they're doing is wrong and they try to conceal it from others. However, some men, especially the most dangerous ones, don't care. They will abuse their partners in any environment. This usually shows two things. Firstly, their normalised view of violence, with them seeing nothing wrong with acting in this way, and also likely their confidence about how much control they have over their victim, with them thinking that even if I beat her up in the middle of the street, she won't report me to the police and I'll get away scot-free. With Hobson, he saw no issue with standing on Claire whilst wielding a knife in the middle of the street. Unfortunately, in the UK, and I assume around the world, many perpetrators do get away with their crimes because their victims refuse to make a statement against them, so any case falls apart. This is often through fear, with the victim fearing that if they do report the crime to the police, then they'll come to serious harm, or potentially even be murdered. However, if you see someone being abused in the middle of the street, there are a few things you can do. Firstly, if it's safe, intervene. I think it's all our responsibility to try and protect people who are being abused by their partners. Secondly, if you see something like this, get your mobile phone out and film it, obviously from a safe distance. This isn't for morbid curiosity, but if you can capture what's going on, it's evidence. And even if the victim doesn't support a case, then you may be able to provide enough information that they can pursue what's known in the UK as a victimless prosecution, where, even if the victim withdraws their statement or complaint, there's enough evidence that people like this can't get away with it. Gary Heidnik was an American double murderer, a serial rapist with a hatred of women, who, over a 4-month period between 1986 and 1987, abducted 6 women off the streets of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and held them captive in the basement of his home. He beat, tortured, and raped his captives, and whilst 4 of them miraculously survived, 2 were murdered, and one of these was dismembered. Heidnik was one of the inspirations for the character Buffalo Bill from the film Silence of the Lambs. But when you hear his story, I've no doubt you'll think he's a man far worse than any movie villain, and what he put these women through was worse than any horror movie, and like something out of a nightmare. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Gary Michael Heidnik was born on November the 22nd, 1943, in the Cleveland suburb of Eastlake in Ohio, to Michael and Ellen. He also had a younger brother, Trevor. Whilst Michael stated the boys were raised in a loving household, it appears it was anything but. Trevor later reported that Michael was extremely violent towards all members of the family and would beat his sons and his wife. Trevor said in an interview in 1987, quote, "Got to the point where we'd be afraid to pick anything up because he'd beat us if we dropped something like a glass or something. I was knocked unconscious once." When Heidnik was 3 years old, his parents separated and the boys went to live with their mother. However, this environment was also no place for a child, with their mother having issues with alcohol. She would often leave the children alone or she went out drinking, bringing home different men most nights. After 4 years, the boys were returned to the care of their father and his new wife, as his mother could no longer take care of them. So both of them went out of the frying pan and back into the fire, and Heidnik reported persistent emotional and psychological abuse by his father. Heidnik was a chronic bedwetter, with his father humiliating him whenever this happened, by making him hang the urine-soaked sheets out the window, in full view of the neighbours. Also, it's reported that Heidnik and his brother were forced to wear trousers with, I assume, fabric bullseyes sewn onto them, which children at school would kick. This compounded the abuse that Heidnik already suffered, due to him receiving a serious injury to his head when he was 6 years old, which left it misshapen after he fell out of a tree. In addition, Michael had particularly discriminatory attitudes and beliefs regarding African Americans, and instilled in his sons his racist views that these individuals were lesser forms of life due to the colour of their skin. Heidnik was a morose, and solitary child. He made no effort to engage with other children and appeared very aloof. On one occasion, Heidnik was approached by a female student who asked him if he'd done his homework, to which Heidnik responded by shouting at her, saying she was, quote, not worthy to speak to him. Heidnik excelled academically and was reported to have an IQ of 148, which would put him in the exceptionally gifted category. However, he had no direction in life and seemed rudderless, with him flitting from one potential profession to another. This began at the age of 14 years old, when Heidnik enrolled at Staunton Military Academy in Staunton, Virginia, but dropped out 2 years later before graduating. He then returned to school, but then dropped out at the age of 17 and joined the United States Army. It appeared that, by this point, Heidnik had developed two obsessions: becoming an army officer and making money. Heidnik was described as an excellent recruit, but following basic training, he was rejected from several specialist positions. This included in the military police, and instead he trained as an army medic in San Antonio, Texas, and, as a side hustle, he lent money to fellow soldiers and charged them interest on these loans. Heidnik was then transferred to a field hospital in West Germany. However, things began to fall apart for Gary Heidnik in late August 1962, at the age of 19, when he went to the sick bay, complaining of dizziness, blurred vision, and nausea. It's also noted that Heidnik began showing signs of mental illness, and although it's not clear what he was suffering from, given the fact he was prescribed antipsychotics, it's likely he was showing signs of schizophrenia, which potentially included him experiencing delusions and hallucinations. However, there are some who believe that he faked this diagnosis to get a discharge from the army. However, it should be noted that mental illness does appear to have been a common factor in Heidnik's family, with his brother Trevor spending time in mental institutions and attempting suicide multiple times during his life. And in 1970, Ellen, his mother, committed suicide by poisoning herself. With regards to Heidnik, he would be admitted to psychiatric hospitals no less than 20 times between 1962 and 1987 due to repeated suicide attempts. In October 1962, Heidnik was transferred to a military hospital in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where he was diagnosed with schizoid personality disorder. This is a condition characterized by someone who chooses to be alone and chooses to pursue solitary habits, whilst having little or no desire to interact with others outside of necessary interactions. They also have difficulty expressing emotions and reacting appropriately to situations, and they're often outwardly humorless, emotionally detached, and cold to others. It appears, due to this diagnosis, Heidnik was honourably discharged from the army and given a disability allowance. Heidnik had served a grand total of 13 months serving his country. Shortly after his discharge, he became a licensed practical nurse and enrolled at the University of Pennsylvania, only to drop out a single semester later. He worked at a VA hospital in Coatesville, but was fired for poor attendance and rude behaviour towards patients, with him showing no empathy towards them and being aggressive generally towards staff and patients. It appears that despite his high intellect, Heidnik was unable to hold down a job or actually pursue a career, and he appears to have been quite entitled. It seems like he wanted to be handed professions on a plate, but when he found out this wouldn't happen immediately and would require some work, he would leave. So, with the army, when he realised he wasn't going to be promoted to a 4-star general by a week on Thursday, he got bored and wandered off. It's important to note the types of jobs or careers Heidnik was pursuing, with them all being ones where someone has power over another, whether this be an officer in the armed forces, a police officer, or a nurse. In October 1971, Heidnik set up a church called, quote, the United Church of the Ministers of God. Initially, the church had just 5 members. In 1975, he opened an account under the church's name with Merrill Lynch. The initial deposit was $1,500, but through shrewd investment, within 10 years Heidnik had turned this into $500,000, and the church eventually grew to 50 devoted followers, led by the self-anointed Bishop Gary Heidnik. It appears this church was, in part, set up so that Heidnik could avoid paying taxes, but I think it served another purpose. It gave Heidnik a captive audience. It gave him people that would hang on his every word, and give him the sense of power he'd been attempting to find throughout his life up until this point. As his church gave him money and sense of power, Heidnik stuck with it. It was still active at the time of his arrest in 1987, with then contacting investigators to ask whether Bishop Heidnik would soon be released to lead the congregation. Some authors say that Heidnick's ultimate intention was to turn his church into a cult, and I wouldn't be surprised, as it's clear he was a man who wanted power and others doing exactly what he said, following his every command without question. However, whilst Heidnick professed to speak the word of God, his behaviour towards others was anything but holy. It appears that Gary Heidnick's first serious brush with the law was in 1976, when, after a disagreement with the tenant at a house he was renting, he fired a gun at him, with the bullet grazing his face. It's reported that in the 1970s, Heidnick would begin relationships with African-American women, with him telling others that these women, quote, treated him better than whites ever did. However, he would also specifically pick women with severe learning disabilities. This, I think, is a combination of Heidnick's racist beliefs, his narcissism, and further evidence of him wanting to place himself in positions where he controlled people. Due to his childhood, it appears that Heidnick considered African Americans to be inferior and therefore less of a threat to him. When you also add in the disability aspect, in his mind, Heidnick likely felt there was a massive power disparity in these relationships, with him being totally in control of them, being able to use and abuse his partners at will. One such woman was called Anjanette Davidson, who had significant learning disabilities. Anjanette had a sister, Alberta, who lived in a mental health institute. Alberta was a 34-year-old woman who had the mental capacity of a 5-year-old. One day in 1978, Heidnick signed Alberta out of the institution, apparently on day release. He then took her back to his property and kept her chained up in the basement. Over the next 9 days, he repeatedly raped and sodomized Alberta. Where she didn't return, the institution called the police and a search was conducted of Heidnick's property, but nothing was found, and he bought time by claiming that he put her back on a bus home. When a second search was conducted, Alberta was found confined in a small storeroom in the basement. After Alberta was medically examined, she was found to have clear signs of sexual assault, including tears in her vagina. She had also contracted gonorrhea. Heidnick was subsequently charged with kidnapping, rape, forced imprisonment, unlawful restraint, and interfering with the custody of a committed person, amongst other offences. At his trial in November 1978, Heidnick pleaded not guilty, and heartbreakingly, Alberta, due to her cognitive difficulties, was deemed unfit to testify. So, as opposed to a list of charges which would have placed Gary Heidnick behind bars forever, many of the most serious charges had to be dropped. He was eventually only convicted of unlawful restraint, interfering with the custody of a committed person, and recklessly endangering another person. Psychiatrists who assessed Heidnick indicates he showed no remorse for his actions and was extremely likely to commit similar or worse offences in the future. Heidnick was sentenced to 3 to 7 years in the state penitentiary, eventually serving 4 and being released on March 24, 1983. It isn't clear whether Heidnick's initial thinking around targeting mentally disabled women included the fact that, if he was caught, he could simply plead not guilty and they would not be able to testify against him. I think this is likely. However, even if this wasn't the case, he now had an example of the power of this strategy, with him likely thinking, yeah, I went to prison, but I served 4 rather than 24 years. I've no doubt that Heidnick was looking for loopholes and ways to avoid detection and punishment, whilst planning and fantasizing about his ultimate goal, to have control over completely subservient women who would be his personal sex slaves. Soon after his release from prison, Heidnick began using a matrimonial service and began to communicate with a woman called Betty Disto in the Philippines. In September 1985, she flew over to the US and married Heidnick in Maryland on the 3rd of October 1985. No doubt Heidnick thought that she, due to her ethnic origin, would be subservient and easy to control. He was wrong. Betty would frequently voice her concerns and hold her husband accountable for his appalling behaviour, which included him forcing her to watch whilst he had sex with other women. During their brief marriage, Betty was raped and beaten repeatedly, and it was only with the help of the Filipino community in Philadelphia that she was able to escape the marriage in January 1986. Soon afterwards, Heidnick was arrested for assault, indecent assault, spousal rape, and involuntary deviant sexual intercourse, but all charges were dropped when Betty, like Ruffier, did not attend the court case. At this point, I imagine the wheels in Heidnik's twisted mind were turning, with him realizing that if he wished to have a harem of women at his command, he needs to return to his original victim typology and replicate the behavior which had given him some limited success before, specifically, in the case of Alberta, confining this woman in the basement. If he could find similar vulnerable women and bring them to his basement, he would have the on-demand sex slaves he was desperate to acquire. By November 1986, Heidnik decides to put his horrific plan into action. In total, Gary Heidnik abducted 6 women from the streets of Philadelphia, with the first being 25-year-old Josefina Rivera, who, on November the 25th, 1986, was working as a prostitute in order to support her family. She was picked up by Heidnik in his white Cadillac, where he paid her for her services. After this, they went to McDonald's, where Heidnik bought Josefina some coffee. Josefina then agreed to a further trade of sex for money, but this time Heidnik wanted to do it at his home, to which she agreed. So Heidnik drove Josefina to 3520 North Marshall Street. Josefina later recalled being suspicious when she got to the home, noticing that in the front door was half the key, with Heidnik having the other half, and the door could only be opened when these two parts were held together. What Josefina didn't realise was that this was so that the keyhole could not be seen through, and the lock was essentially blocked, meaning it could only be opened from the outside. After having sex in the main bedroom, Josefina went to put her clothes back on, and Heidnik then grabbed her by the neck from behind and began to choke her. She begged him to stop, but instead, he handcuffed her wrists and pushed her down the stairs to the basement. Heidnik then got a shovel and began digging a hole in the floor of the basement, whilst telling the handcuffed Josefina that he was planning to capture 10 women whom he would force to get pregnant, and then they would raise his children. She was then pushed through the hole. She tried to escape but could not, and Heidnik left and didn't return for 27 hours. But when he didn't return alone. Sandra Lindsay was also 25 years old, and she was extremely vulnerable and was a patient at a care facility called the Elwyn Institute. Sandra was already known to Heidnik, as he'd previously raped her in the facility where she was staying, and she'd fallen pregnant, but had an abortion. On November the 26th, 1986, Heidnik took Sandra from the Elwyn Institute and brought her back to his home. Heidnik told Sandra to write a letter to her mother, saying she'd left the institute and that she was fine. He then went to New York and posted this letter. However, Sandra's mother did not believe the contents and went to the police. She must have known about Heidnik, as she gave the police his address and said her daughter was likely being held there. Tragically, the police did nothing, assuming Sandra was just another runaway. On the first night that both women were together, they were viciously raped and beaten by Heidnik, and this pattern continued each and every day. They were kept naked and had to huddle together for warmth in the unheated basement. They slowly began to fall ill due to hypothermia, starvation, and dehydration. On the 22nd of December 1986, 19-year-old Lisa Thomas was walking to a friend's house when Heidnik pulled up alongside her and asked if she was working the streets. Lisa was not a prostitute and was offended. Heidnik said he would take her wherever she wanted as a way to apologise. Eventually, the pair ended up going to dinner and then back to his house, where he drugged her wine, and Lisa soon fell unconscious. She awoke to Heidnik dragging her to the bedroom, where he raped her. He then handcuffed her and threw her in the pit in the basement. On the 2nd of January 1987, Heidnik abducted 23-year-old Deborah Dudley. It's not known how he came across her, but it appears that she was potentially homeless at the time. Deborah fought every step of the way, and Heidnik had trouble subduing her and placing her in the hole. She was viciously beaten and eventually took her place with the other captives. 18-year-old Jacqueline Askins was a sex worker who Heidnik picked up on the 18th of January 1987. After agreeing to money for sex, Jacqueline went to Heidnik's home and, after having sex, he strangled her, cuffed her, and forced her into the hole. So by the 18th of January 1987, there were 5 women chained up in Gary Heidnick's basement. By this point, the first woman he abducted, Josefina Rivera, had been living this nightmare for 52 days. Heidnick would rape and beat the women without mercy. He'd also try to divide and conquer them, with him assigning one as the leader when he went out. And when he got back, he would ask the leader which of the women had misbehaved. If no one was singled out, they would all be beaten. No doubt in order to heighten their terror, Heidnick would shove sharp objects into the women's ears in an attempt to deafen them so they could not hear him coming, but also so they didn't know when he'd left so they couldn't try to escape. Heidnick would feed the women as and when he pleased, and his erratic behaviour appeared to dictate how often they would be fed and what they would receive. On some days they'd get nothing, on other days they might get dog food, but on one occasion to celebrate one of the captive women's birthdays, he provided them with Chinese food and champagne. However, the women were malnourished, dehydrated, suffering from hypothermia, battered, bruised, and in considerable pain, with several of them becoming seriously unwell, especially Sandra Lindsay. In February 1987, Sandra angered Heidnick by trying to remove the planks of wood that sat over the hole in the basement. In response, he handcuffed one of Sandra's wrists to a beam in the ceiling and left her hanging there for days. Convinced she was pregnant with his child, Heidnick tried to force feed her in order to keep the child alive. But, in a weakened state, Sandra's body was beginning to give up. Eventually, she died, and when the handcuff was removed, she slumped to the floor. Josefina said when she saw Sandra was dead, quote, "I was broken-hearted. Me and Sandra were close. We spent so many hours together in the hole." Heidnick, the monster that he was, with cold efficiency, then sought to get rid of Sandra's body. He forced the other women to be involved in dissecting her body and used a power saw to remove her limbs, with him putting Sandra's legs and arms in the freezer, marking them as, quote, "dog food." Heidnick cooked her ribs in the oven and put Sandra's head on a stove to boil. Heidnick showed Deborah Dudley, who had fought him so hard when she was abducted, Sandra's head on the stove and warned her that she would end up the same way if she defied him. There's a rumour that Sandra's remains were ground up, mixed with dog food and fed to the other women, but this isn't backed up by the evidence. The putrid smell from cooking Sandra's body parts led to neighbours calling the police, and, when they attended, Heidnick simply said that he burnt a roast, and they left. Whilst raping and torturing these women, Heidnick would occasionally leave the basement, go upstairs in his property, and hold sermons for his church congregation before returning to continue his vile abuse. Heidnick would also use electricity to torture the women, applying a live wire to their chains, giving them electric shocks. On March 19, 1987, Heidnick put 3 of the women, including Deborah Dudley, into a pit filled with water whilst they were wearing chains. He then applied mains current to their bindings, and, as a result of this, Deborah died. By this point, Josefina realized the only way she was going to survive was to pretend to be compliant, and she began to convince Heidnick that she was enjoying her time with him, and she was given more trust and more freedom. This included her assisting him in removing Deborah's body from the property and dumping her remains, and agreeing with him that they needed to abduct another woman in order to replace the 2 who had died. As a result of this, Heidnick would take Josefina out in his car in order to look for women to abduct. On the 23rd of March 1987, they came across 24-year-old Agnes Adams, who was known to both of them, as Heidnick had previously engaged in her services as a sex worker, and Josefina from when the pair had worked in a strip club together. She was taken back to the property, assaulted, and forced into the hole in the basement. This appeared to cement Heidnick's trust in Josefina, and on the 24th of March 1987, she asked if she could go visit family, and she promised to return with a new woman for his collection. Heidnick agreed and drove Josefina to a petrol station and said he would wait there while she went to see her relatives. Josefina then walked a short distance away and called the police. When they arrived, they saw the imprint of restraints on her leg and thankfully believed her. The police then drove to the petrol station and arrested Gary Heidnik. The police then went to Heidnik's property and opened the basement to release the surviving women. This stunning and horrific picture shows where the officers found when they peered into the hole. The police were able to recover the body of Deborah Dudley and were able to recover some of the body parts of Sandra Lindsay. This included removing her arms and legs from the freezer. They also found pieces of her thigh, skin, and muscle, all neatly wrapped. Over 27 pounds of dismembered human remains were recovered in total. To close this section, I want to play a short clip of Josefina Rivera talking about her experiences in around 2014.
Here with me now is Josefina Rivera. Thank you so much, Josefina. I've watched this. This is the first time that I've actually seen this, and I'm trying to hold back my tears.
Right.
So I can't even imagine what you endured.
We endured a lot. We really endured a lot. I truly endured a lot, especially in the beginning, being the first one. I could just so remember just sleeping with handcuffs behind my back every night and chains on my ankles, and I would wake up and just think it was a dream, you know.
Or a nightmare, really.
A nightmare.
Right. During that time, what kept you going? What kept you alive throughout all the torture and the cruelty that you endured on a daily basis?
You know, through the strength of God, and I just said I'm going out of here the way I came in here. If I walked in here, I'm going to walk out of here.
So that was really that's what kept you focused
yes,
on that you're going to get at, that sense of determination.
Right.
What was the interaction between you and the other women?
It was really, really very difficult. I mean, we're in a situation where none of us know each other, and each one is dealing with different mental stability. And you know, I tried my best, being the first one down there, trying to calm everybody that came down. It didn't always work, you know, but, you know, you try to, you know, sit down and talk and try to keep them, you know, you ask them about their family and their kids and their life, and, you know, try to make it a little bit normalcy for them as much as possible, you know, and try to say, well, hey, you're going to be all right, you know, we're going to try to get out of here alive. And it was difficult at times. It was. When Sandra died, me and Sandra had been there from the beginning, so when Sandra died, it just really broke my heart, and it just really made me see the severity of Gary Heidnik.
Did you think you were next after she died? Did you think that he was going to go after you?
Oh, at that point, it was like anything could happen. You know, it was like a day-by-day thing. It was just, each day was worse than the day before. You know, and it just never seemed like it was getting any better.
Did you ever think, Josefina, that you were going to get out of there? Did you ever plot it? Did you ever talk
I didn't plot it. I really didn't realize how much Gary Heidnik actually liked me and how much I was getting through to him until the last few days. I knew I was going to get out of there one way or another. I mean, that was like my ultimate goal, was to make sure that I got out safely and he couldn't get to me and he couldn't get back to the other girls and get rid of them, you know. And so I don't know if there was a plan, but it worked out.
But a sense of survival that you
Yes.
had to keep yourself going throughout, no matter what.
Exactly,
That time.
and trying to deal with Heidnik himself, and then trying to deal with the other girls, and trying to put something together. It was amazing.
Now you still have some injury from what he did with
Right,
your
this
ear.
year.
Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, he found out that we could hear him underground coming in and out, his car pulling in and out of the driveway, because his basement sat underground and we could hear him walking through the house. So he decided to take screwdrivers and damage our eardrums with screwdrivers.
Did you?
To dent our ears so that we wouldn't be able to hear him coming in and out.
And you still have difficulty with hearing.
Oh yeah, everything I listen to is loud.
Now, you have children, and you were reunited with your children.
Yes, I
recently.
was.
How's
Ricky and Zornay, I put up for adoption right after the Heidnik thing happened. At the time, the foster parents and Zornay and Ricky were very close, and they were in a loving home. I personally, mentally or physically, wasn't mentally capable of taking care of them. So my decision for them to allow them to adopt them was, was a good thing. Me and LaToya stayed in touch. She came back and lived with me when she was 12, and we stayed close.
Remember what I said about Gary Heidnik having an almost genius level IQ before? Well, on the 23rd of April 1987, he walked into court and pleaded not guilty to all offences. His initial defence? The women were already there when he moved in. That's it. This later appears to have changed him, claiming he knew about the women, but they'd killed each other. Heidnik also made claims of cannibalism, but this was not backed up by evidence when forensic analysis of cooking utensils was undertaken, and it appears this was likely part of an insanity defence. The question of mental illness was central to this case, but the brave testimony of the surviving victims showed how methodical and planned these offences were. In addition, it was pointed out that Heidnik was competent enough to make hundreds of thousands of dollars from investments and run a church for over 10 years. The jury didn't believe a word of it, and on the 1st of July 1988, Gary Heidnik was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder, 5 counts of kidnapping, 5 counts of rape, 4 of aggravated assault, and 1 of involuntary deviant sexual intercourse. He was then sentenced to death. Gary Heidnik spent over a decade on death row and never admitted any guilt or showed any remorse for his crimes. In January 1999, he tried to escape his date with the executioner by attempting to take an overdose, but this was unsuccessful. Before his execution, Heidnik reportedly claimed that he wanted to be executed because the execution of an innocent man would stop the death penalty in America. Just before 10 p.m. on Tuesday, July the 6th, 1999, after a last meal of 2 slices of pizza and black coffee, Gary Heidnik stepped into the death chamber at SCI Rockview and was strapped to the gurney. At 10:12 p.m., the execution began and the lethal injection was administered. He was pronounced dead at 10:29 p.m. And, when this occurred, one of the witnesses reportedly shouted, quote, "Thank you, Jesus." He made no final statement. Before talking about this monster, I want to play a short clip of him speaking during an interview after his incarceration. Look at this man's eyes. I, for one, find them terrifying.
What verbal exchange did you have with the girls down there in the basement?
At first, I tried to make it nice, right?
Yeah, how did you do that, Gary?
I was holding parties there, for one thing. I had a Christmas party and a New Year's party.
Heidnik told agents Douglas and Ray that he had a routine for the women he held captive in his basement.
8, they go down in the hole in the morning, board goes over the top of the hole with the sandbags and et cetera, and then they stay down there till roughly about 8 at night. Okay, now on this particular day...
You got a radio down here, right?
Oh, yeah.
Playing real loud?
Yes.
Why is that? To drown out any noise?
Right.
In case because you're leaving the house sometimes.
Yes.
Yeah, so you don't
I was... I'm not holding nothing back. I realize that's incriminating. That's incriminating for me to say that in a state of mind. I was conscious enough to know that was a conscious act on my part, and that was essentially the reason.
To drown out that noise, for sure.
Well, they might like a little entertainment too,
The radio didn't stop the women from screaming for help, so Gary Heidnik tried shocking them into silence with electricity.
You do say that you were electrocuted as punishment.
Yeah.
And you did that systematically for some time.
No. Only several days. Nothing was working. I was trying to find something that worked that would make them shut up to stop hollering.
So I could progressive kind of infliction of pain on these women.
I was trying to find something that would make them behave.
But it was painful to them.
I hope so. I don't mean I hope so, but I mean, that's what I was trying to achieve, to make them behave.
After one of the victims died from torture, Heidnik told Douglas and Ray he didn't know what to do with the body.
I'm sitting there, trying to figure out what the hell to do, What the to do, I started chopping up the body. It makes me sick just thinking about it. dismembered the body, and I you know, started burning it on the stove and in the oven and stuff, and that was when you got the big smell and all.
You're trying to destroy the evidence.
Right.
See, some people.
I consciously knew I was trying to hide the evidence.
The lack of remorse and delusion in this man is truly horrifying. Gary Heidnik is reported to have been one of the worst, most frightening killers the FBI agent John Douglas ever spoke to. He's the man whose career was the basis for the television series Mindhunter. Remember, he interviewed some of the most depraved and vicious killers of modern time, including Edward Kemper, John Wayne Gacy, and Ted Bundy. So for Heidnik to be at the top of this infamous list is really saying something. I would agree that this man's crimes are particularly heinous, but why did he do it? I think that due to his traumatic childhood, Heidnik developed a general hatred of society, but in particular women, likely due to the lack of care from his mother. Also, due to the racist use of his father, I believe that Heidnik considered those from any ethnic background, but particularly African Americans, as an even lesser form of life. Likely due to his intellect, Heidnik appears to have felt that he was special and worthy of great things, and that others were not worthy of him. Given his gifts, I think that he assumed that people should just hand him power, and so he tried to integrate himself into society by applying for these types of positions. But, due to his own arrogance and his lack of any social skills, he was unable to obtain them, and also likely because he wasn't given what he wanted quickly enough. So, he took matters into his own hands, created scenarios in his own life where he could feel ultimate power over people, reinforcing to himself how superior he was. This included him beginning relationships with women with intellectual disabilities, knowing they were no match for him intellectually. Whilst he likely felt very powerful in these situations, he was essentially an utter coward, a tiny little man who would rape and abuse, in some cases, women who had the mental age of children. Whilst there may have been a financial motivation to him setting up his church, I have no doubt he had aspirations of being a cult leader, having ultimate power over people, commanding their every move, using them any way he wanted, and ultimately ordering their suicide if he deemed it necessary. As he amassed his religious congregation, he also collected women, like objects, using them to get his sexual kicks, and no doubt getting off on the fact they were powerless, he could kill them at any moment. I think that Gary Heidnik considered himself a god and wanted mere mortals to fear him and acknowledge his superiority over them. What Heidnik was ultimately planning to do is anyone's guess. Perhaps he was going to breed a colony, create some cult from the ground up. However, what I find so perfect about this case is that one of these African American women, who he considered so beneath him, outsmarted him, manipulated him into believing that she supported his lunacy, and she was eventually able to take him down and save the lives of others. Elliot Rodger was an American spree killer who, on May the 23rd, 2014, at age 22, ended the lives of 6 innocent people in Isla Vista, California. His rationale for doing this? Simply put, he was punishing society because no girls would sleep with him. However, as I will discuss, this is an oversimplification, and Elliot was a dangerous combination of misogynism, racism, and extreme narcissism. An individual who believed he was, quote, the supreme gentleman, which meant he was entitled to anything you wanted, and those who did not comply deserved to be eliminated. As if Elliot's beliefs and crimes were not horrific enough, he's become a revered figure within the world of involuntary celibates, known as incels, and his words and deeds have been linked to other acts of terror and murder. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Elliot Oliver Robertson Rodger was born on the 24th of July 1991 in London in the UK to his Malaysian Chinese mother Lee Chin and his father, British filmmaker Peter Rodger. I tend to refer to the subjects of my videos by their last names, but as his first and last names could both be first names, I'm just going to refer to him as Elliot, otherwise it may cause confusion, mainly to myself. Whilst there's plenty of information about Elliot's upbringing from official sources, the intricacies of his life, including his perception of his situations and people, is contained within his manifesto/autobiography, which he completed just prior to his death. This 137-page diatribe, entitled, quote, "My Twisted World," is a fascinating and yet horrifying piece of prose, filled with hate, self-delusion, perceived persecution, and self-entitlement. It's a chilling document when you consider that it's basically the rambling self-delusion of a murderer who, by the time of writing it, had already decided to execute members of society because he could not get what he wanted. It begins with the following paragraph, quote, "Humanity. All of my suffering on this world has been at the hands of humanity, particularly women. It has made me realize just how brutal and twisted humanity is as a species. All I ever wanted was to fit in and live a happy life amongst humanity, but I was cast out and rejected, forced to enjoy an existence of loneliness and insignificance, all because the females of the human species were incapable of seeing the value of me. This is the story of how I, Elliot Rodger, came to be. This is the story of my entire life. It's a dark story of sadness, anger, and hatred. It's a story of war against cruel injustice. In this magnificent story, I'll disclose every single detail about my life, every single significant experience that I've pulled from my superior memory, as well as how these experiences have shaped my views of the world. This tragedy did not just happen. I didn't want things to turn out this way, but humanity forced my hand, and this story will explain why. My life did start out dark and twisted. I started out as a happy and blissful child, living my life to the fullest in a world I thought was good and pure. I will refer to this document throughout this video to highlight key moments in Elliot's life and how he perceived them, and how he devolved into a killer. Elliot was raised in a privileged household, in large part due to his father's work as a professional photographer and then a filmmaker, with him being the assistant director on the original Hunger Games movie in 2012. His mother was also involved in the film industry, and Elliot wrote about attending preschool at Dorset House School, West Sussex, where fees begin at around £10,000 a year, so around $12,000. Elliot also described going on frequent holidays abroad, and some years later, even walking the red carpet at the premiere of Star Wars Episode 1 in 1999, due to his mother's friendship with George Lucas. Just before his 5th birthday, his parents gave birth to a sister, Georgia. Soon after this, the family moved to California so his father could be at the heart of the film industry. I think the initial seeds of what Elliot became were sown during these early years. Obviously, people with means who have children will try and give them the best life possible and the best experiences, which is completely understandable. However, I think this needs to be balanced with a reality check, showing them you need to earn things, they're not just handed to you. Just because you come from this background, it doesn't automatically make you special. The true measure of a man is not the size of his bank account. However, I think, for whatever reason, Elliot was not taught this as a child, and he felt entitled to special treatment from others, believing that he was superior, and that it was everyone else's job to recognise this and cater to his needs. At age 7, Elliot's parents separated. It is clear from his own writings this had a significant impact on him, as it took him completely by surprise. Elliot wrote regarding this, quote, "Very shortly after my 7th birthday, the news came. I believe it was my mother who told me that she and my father were getting a divorce. My mother, who only a few months before told me that such a thing would never happen. I was absolutely shocked, outraged, and above all, overwhelmed. This was a huge life-changing event. I think that this is the first signs of issues with women, with the tiny seed being planted in Elliot's mind that the woman he trusted most in the world, his mother, had essentially lied to him. Soon afterwards, Elliot's father began a relationship with a Moroccan film actress called Soumaya Akhaboun. However, clearly there was conflict between her and Elliot, with him writing, quote, "For the initial period of her being a new member of the family, we got along well, she was quite fun, but soon she would start to discipline me in a harsh way that I wasn't used to. I felt that because she wasn't my real parent, she had no right to discipline me in such a way, and so I rebelled. That's where the first conflicts arose. There would be many more to come in later years." This was likely Soumaya trying to instill boundaries on Elliot's behaviour, but, likely because he thought he was special and should be allowed to act in any way he wanted, he did not take kindly to this. And, as the years progressed, it's clear that Elliot saw Soumaya as a thorn in his side, with him writing that when he was 9 years old, quote, "I started to have intense conflicts with Soumaya, I hated the rules she imposed on me, which I believe she had no right to impose, as she wasn't my true parent. Despite his privileged upbringing, it seems that Elliot was actually a very lonely child. He wrote about spending weeks with his mother and father, but during the weeks with his father, he'd be looked after by nannies and barely spend time with his dad. Issues also began to come out around the age of 9, with Elliot admitting that he had always had issues with jealousy throughout his life, as well as crippling insecurities. With the latter of these, Elliot was upset he was short for his age and played basketball, believed this would somehow make him taller. With the former issue, Elliot had intense feelings of resentment and jealousy when his playmates would not focus all their attention on him. If he had 2 friends round, he'd become upset if they began playing with each other and not him. This is an important part of the behaviour of Elliot, which can explain much of his resentment moving forward. Specifically, it appears that Elliot was a timid and shy child who struggled in social interactions. This is not uncommon, and in these situations, even as adults, it's often easier when someone else is leading the conversation or organising events. We can all have the pang of awkwardness or anxiety and potentially jealousy when we go to a party with a friend and then they leave us to go to talk to other people we don't know and we just stand there. But we understand, although it may still be an uncomfortable feeling, this is our issue. Our friend is free to go and do what they please, and people can share their attention without it being some kind of swipe at us. We also know that while some people may come and talk to us, we need to be brave and sometimes take the first step. However, Elliot doesn't appear to have learned this, and as time progressed, he appears to form the opinion that others, and particularly girls, should flock to him, chase him, and pay him full attention without him making any effort. When he entered the room, all eyes should turn to him, and women, even if they were mid-sentence, should drop what they were doing and throw themselves at his feet. If they did not, this was an affront to him personally. Moving forward several years, Elliot became a brother when he was 12 years old, with his father and Sumaya having a baby boy called Jazz. Elliot seemed excited to become a brother, but unfortunately, as his brother grew, Elliot began to see him as a rival, someone who might surpass him and take attention away from him, something he could not stand. All through his early years, it appears that his mother and stepmother would arrange playdates with other children and try to get Elliot to socialise. But by the time he was 13, he had only one friend and struggled to socialise with others. He found solace in online gaming as a distraction from, quote, the harsh realities of life I was too scared to face. Elliot was teased by girls in middle school, and one in particular seems to have led him to develop a hatred of girls. He began acting up as a way to get attention, with him writing prophetically, quote, as middle school approached its ultimate end, I was having a miserable time there. I was extremely unpopular, widely disliked, and viewed as the weirdest kid in the school. I had to act weird in order to gain attention. I was tired of being the invisible shy child. Infamy is better than total obscurity. High school was an even bigger challenge for Elliot, as he was now going through puberty, and he stated, quote, I developed a very high sex drive and would always remain like this. This was the start of hell for me. Going through puberty utterly doomed my existence. It condemned me to a life of suffering and unfulfilled desires. Even at that young age, I felt depressed because I wanted sex, yet I felt unworthy of it. I didn't think I was ever going to experience sex in reality, and I was right. I never did. I was finally interested in girls, but there was no way I could ever get them, and so my starvation began. The boys in my grade talked about sex a lot. Some of them even told me they had sex with their girlfriends. This was the most devastating and traumatizing thing I've heard in my life. Boys having sex at my age of 14, I couldn't fathom it. How is it they're able to have such intimate and pleasurable experiences with girls while I can only fantasize about it? I frequently started asking myself, this was an all-boys school. How in the hell were these boys able to meet girls to have sex with? I wondered. I hoped they were lying. I hoped against hope. Hearing that really shook me to the core. Words cannot describe how much hatred and envy I felt for those boys. That hatred would only fester the more I suffer from my sexual starvation. I was too scared to tell anyone about it, and I hid it well, for a time. These recent events caused me to withdraw even further away from the world. I drowned all of my misery in my online games. Elliot described his schoolmates bullying him, whilst apparently then returning to their attractive girlfriends. He had scathing resentment towards the bullies, but more so towards the girls they were with. Why did they choose these bullies over him? At the age of 17 years old, Elliot's mindset became more radicalized, and he began devolving into the spiteful, hate-filled individual that 5 years later would go on a killing spree. He wrote that, quote, "One day I found some posts on the internet about teenagers having sex, and I was once again reminded of the life I've been denied. I felt that no girl would ever want to have sex with me, and I developed extreme feelings of envy, hatred, and anger towards anyone who has a sex life. I saw them as the enemy. I felt condemned to live a life of lonely celibacy, while other boys were allowed to experience the pleasures of sex, all because girls didn't want me. I felt inferior and undesirable. This time, however, I couldn't just stand by and accept such an injustice anymore. I refused to continue hiding away from the world and forgetting about all the insults it's dealt to me. I began to have fancies of becoming very powerful and stopping everyone from having sex. I wanted to take their sex away from them, just like they took it away from me. I saw sex as an evil and barbaric act, all because I was unable to have it. This was the major turning point. My anger made me stronger inside. This is when I formed my ideas that sex should be outlawed. It's the only way to make the world a fair and just place. If I can't have it, I will destroy it." That's the conclusion I came to right then and there. I spent more time studying the world, seeing the world for the horrible, unfair place it is. I then had the revelation that just because I was condemned to suffer a life of loneliness and rejection doesn't mean I am insignificant. I have an exceptionally high level of intelligence. I see the world differently than anyone else. Because of all of the injustices I went through and the worldview I developed because of them, I must be destined for greatness. I must be destined to change the world, to shape it into an image that suits me. Elliot seemed to have spent the next 2 years turning further in on himself, reading books that reinforced his increasingly misogynistic attitudes, cutting himself off from the real world, and losing himself in video games where he would end up in arguments with people if they even mentioned having a girlfriend. On the rare occasions that Elliot would go out with males his own age, and there were girls present, he would sit there and see that these girls had the disrespect to talk to these men and not focus all their attention on him. The really curious thing about Elliot's ramblings is there's almost not a single instance of him ever talking to a girl or going on a date and being rejected. This wouldn't justify his beliefs, but it would enable some level of understanding. Rather, it seems he literally sat on the sidelines, growing more and more resentful whenever he saw any man and woman his age interacting, not trying to do anything about his situation and likely making him unapproachable. I mean, imagine you're a woman walking up to the table with two men, and each time you're trying to interact with one of them, the other is becoming more and more irritable, rude and obnoxious. You're hardly going to want to talk to that person. But in Elliot's world, women should be throwing themselves at his feet, begging him to have sex with them whilst he does nothing, because he was entitled to this. He was special, but the world just couldn't see it. He wasn't the problem, everyone else was. At the age of 19 years old, Elliot Rodger was becoming more unhinged, and around this time, he moved to an apartment in Santa Barbara to attend the University of California, Santa Barbara, and ominously wrote at this time, quote, "The move to Santa Barbara is the end game, the ultimate climax of everything. I saw it as a new chance that was given to me to finally have the things I want in life: love, sex, friends, fun, acceptance, a sense of belonging. But I could never forgive the world for denying me such things in the past. I was already turning 20 soon. I already lost many years of my life. I deserve better than that. I am an intelligent gentleman. I deserve the love of girls more than the other obnoxious boys of my age. And yet, they get girls and I don't. This is a crime that can never be forgotten, nor can it be forgiven. I always wanted to exact my revenge on humanity for forcing me to live such a life, but I've also always had the hope that if I can do things in my life to make up for all my suffering, then that in itself would be a form of peaceful revenge. In truth, the move to Santa Barbara was actually a chance that I was giving to the world, not the other way around. I was giving the world one last chance to give me the life that I know I'm entitled to, the life that other boys are able to live with ease. If I still have to suffer the same rejection and injustice, even after I move to Santa Barbara, then that will be the last straw. I will have my vengeance." However, Elliot found issues almost immediately with Santa Barbara. Despite not leaving the property and doing anything about his situation, he was unhappy that he was not instantly presented with sexual opportunities and resented his housemates, who he claimed would frequently brag about their success with girls. Elliot's musings then demonstrate his racist attitudes and his extreme narcissistic beliefs, with him writing about his annoyance with an African-American man who had more success with women than him. Quote, "How could an inferior, ugly black boy be able to get a white girl and not me? I am beautiful, and I'm half white myself. I am descended from British aristocracy. He is descended from slaves. I deserve it more." I tried not to believe his foul words, but they were already said. It was hard to erase them from my mind. If this is actually true, if this ugly black filth was able to have sex with a blonde white girl at the age of 13, whilst I've had to suffer virginity all my life, then this just proves how ridiculous the female gender is. They would give themselves to this filthy scum, but they reject me, the injustice. Females truly have something mentally wrong with them. Their minds are flawed, and at this point in my life, I was beginning to see it. The more I explored my college town of Isla Vista, the more ridiculousness I witnessed. All of the hot, beautiful girls walked around with obnoxious, tough, jock-type men who passed all the time and acted crazy. They should be going for intelligent gentlemen such as myself. Women are sexually attracted to the wrong type of men. It's a major flaw in the very foundation of humanity. It's completely and utterly wrong in every sense of the word. As his truth fully dawned on me, I became deeply disturbed by them, deeply disturbed, offended, and traumatized. College was like a red rag-tailed ball for Elliot. He was surrounded by thousands of young couples, and each time he saw this, he became more and more enraged about his apparent injustice in life. He deserved these things, yet no one was simply handing this to him. So, in his mind, no one should have anything. Around this time, Elliot began recording videos to upload to YouTube, moaning about how unfair his life was, and he appears to have driven round specifically looking for situations to antagonize himself, and then filming them, as shown by this video. Elliot Roger here. I'm just sitting in my car right now, enjoying the view of the beach, and my view has been ruined by this sight right here. In front of me, sitting right there on that bench, is a young couple. I was enjoying such a nice view until they came and sat down and started kissing. This is the reason why life isn't fair. Why can't I experience something like that? I have to show everyone why I hate the world, because no girl would do this with me. I hate them. I hate them so much. It's not fair. Life is not fair. Elliot soon began acting on his anger, initially in small ways, including following a couple out of Starbucks and throwing his coffee over their car, and later filling a super soak with orange juice and squirting couples in the park. Elliot wrote, quote, "It was around this point in my life that I realized I was capable of doing such things. I would happily do such things. I was capable of killing them, and I wanted to. I wanted to kill them slowly, to strip the skins off their flesh. They deserve it. The males deserve it for taking the females away from me, and the females deserved it for choosing those males instead of me. Ever since I was 17, I often fantasized about becoming powerful and inflicting suffering upon everyone who has wronged me in the past, but never thought I'd actually do it. At this point, after going through so much suffering and injustice, all of my innocence had been swept away. The world had been cruel to me, and it molded me to become strong enough to actually have the capability of returning that cruelness to the world. I'd never been a violent person in nature, but after building up so much hatred over the years, I realized that I wouldn't hesitate to kill or even torture my hated enemies if I was given the opportunity. In around 2012, Elliot began to plan for, quote, the day of retribution, where he would take revenge on society, and especially the girls who shunned him. He stated, quote, "My first act of preparation was the purchase of my first handgun. I did this quickly and hastily at a local gun shop called Galetta Gun and Supply. I'd already done some research of handguns. I decided to purchase the Glock 34 semi-automatic pistol, an efficient and highly accurate weapon. I signed all of the papers, was told my pickup day was in mid-December. That fell in nicely, because that was when I was planning on staying in Santa Barbara till. After I picked up the handgun, I brought it back to my room and felt a new sense of power. I was now armed. Who's the alpha male now, bitches? I thought to myself, regarding all of the girls who've looked down on me in the past. I could give Mad my new weapon before locking it up in my safe and preparing to go back to my hometown for the winter break. In spring 2013, Elliot purchased another 2 home guns and began collecting ammunition and planning his revenge, which was underpinned by his belief that, quote, women must be punished for their crimes of rejecting such a magnificent gentleman as myself. Around this time, Elliot joined online forums with similarly disturbed and misogynistic young men who were apparently starved of sex. No doubt, on these forums, Elliot found kindred spirits, and they reinforced his own views of women and cemented his perception that he was the victim, with him writing, quote, I concluded that women are flawed. There is something mentally wrong with the way their brains are wired, as if they haven't evolved from animal-like thinking. They're incapable of reason or thinking rationally. They're like animals, completely controlled by their primal, depraved emotions and impulses. This is what they are attracted to, barbaric, wild, beast-like men. They're beasts themselves. Beasts should not be able to have any rights in a civilized society. If their wickedness is not contained, the whole of humanity will be held back from advancement to a more civilized state. Women should not have the right to choose who to mate with. That choice should be made for them by civilized men of intelligence. If women have the freedom to choose which men to mate with, like they do today, they would breed with stupid, degenerate men, which would only produce stupid, degenerate offspring. This in turn would hinder the advancement of humanity. Not only hinder it, but devolve humanity completely. Women are like a plague that must be quarantined. When I came to this brilliant, perfect revelation, I felt like everything was now clear to me in a bitter, twisted way. I'm one of the few people on this world who has the intelligence to see this. I'm like a god, and my purpose is to exact ultimate retribution on all of the impurities I see in the world. So women are inferior, and should literally be presented to men like him to have sex with. No consent, no choice in the matter. Sounds like rape to me. Many articles I've read have said that Elliot Rodger did what he did because he couldn't get a girlfriend. This is completely incorrect. Elliot Rodger was not interested in a girlfriend. He was not interested in any emotional connection with a female. He saw women merely as objects to get his sexual needs met. Like a classic narcissist, he saw value only in what people could give to him. Hence why he was advocating basically a system where women would be used and abused by men based on an allocation system, with him likely seeing himself as the overseer of this twisted system. From approximately 2012, Elliot was completely alone. His behaviour and attitudes had pushed everyone away. However, concerns about his mental health were flagged, but not acted upon. Specifically, in April 2014, just weeks before the rampage, his mother found the videos that Elliot had posted on YouTube and was concerned, so called one of his counsellors. The counsellor called mental health services, and then the police. Santa Barbara County Sheriff's deputies showed up at Elliot's doorstep to check on his mental health. However, they weren't aware of any of the videos. They determined that Elliot was a well-mannered, if shy young man who posed no risk. They then left. This was the last opportunity to stop Elliot. There'll be no more chances. Elliot had planned his day of retribution in great detail, writing the following long description. He said, quote, on the day before the day of retribution, I will start the first phase of my vengeance. Started killing as many people as I can around Isla Vista by luring them into my apartment through some form of trickery. The first people I would have to kill are my 2 housemates to secure the entire apartment for myself as my personal torture and killing chamber. After that, I'll start luring people into my apartment, knock them out with a hammer and slit their throats. I'll torture some of the good-looking people before I kill them, assuming that the good-looking ones had the best sex lives. All of that pleasure they had in their life, I will punish by bringing them pain and suffering. I've lived a life of pain and suffering, and it's time to bring that pain to people who actually deserve it. I will cut them, flay them, strip all the skin off their flesh, and pour boiling water all over them while they're still alive, as well as any other form of torture I can possibly think of. When they're dead, I'll behead them and keep their heads in a bag, for their heads will play a major role in the final phase. This first phase will represent my vengeance against all of the men who've had pleasurable sex lives while I've had to suffer. Things will be fair once I make them suffer as I did. I will finally even the score. The second phase will take place on the day of retribution itself, just before the climactic massacre. The second phase will represent my war on women. I will punish all females for the crime of depriving me of sex. They have starved me of sex for my entire youth and gave that pleasure to other men. In doing so, they took many years of my life away. I cannot kill every single female on earth, but I can deliver a devastating blow that will shake all of them to the core of their wicked hearts. I'll attack the very girls who represent everything I hate in the female gender, the hottest sorority of UCSB. After doing a lot of extensive research within the last year, I found out that the sorority with the most beautiful girls is Alpha Phi sorority. I know exactly where their house is, and I've sat outside it in my car to stalk them many times. Alpha Phi sorority is full of hot, beautiful blonde girls, the kind of girls I've always desired, but was never able to have because they all look down on me. They're all spoilt, heartless, wicked bitches. They think they're superior to me, and if I ever try to ask them on a date, they'll reject me cruelly. I will sneak into their house at around 9 PM on the day of retribution, just before all of the partying starts, and slaughter every single one of them with my guns and knives. If I have time, I'll set their whole house on fire, then we shall see who the superior one really is. The final phase of the day of retribution will be my ultimate showdown in the streets of Isla Vista. On the morning before, I will drive down to my father's house to kill my little brother, denying him of the chance to grow up to surpass me, along with my stepmother, Sumaya, as she will be in the way. My father will be away on one of his business trips, so thankfully, I won't have to deal with him. If he didn't go away on that trip, I might even have to postpone the whole plan because of my fear that I might hesitate if I had to kill him. Once I've taken care of my brother and stepmother, I will switch to the Mercedes SUV and drive it back to the Isla Vista. I will use it as one of my killing machines against my enemies. An SUV will cause a lot more damage than my BMW. After I have killed all of the sorority girls at the Alpha Phi house, I will quickly get into the SUV before the police arrive, assuming they would arrive within 3 minutes. I will then make my way to Del Playa, splattering as many of my enemies as I can with the SUV and shooting anyone I don't splatter. I can only imagine how sweet it will be to ram the SUV into all of these groups of popular young people who I've always witnessed walking right in the middle of the road as if they are better than everyone else. When they're writhing in pain, their bodies broken and dying after I splatter them, they will fully realize their crimes. Once I reach Del Playa Street, I will dump the bag of severed heads I have saved from my previous victims, proclaiming to everyone how much I've made them all suffer. Once they see all of their friends' heads roll onto the street, everyone will fear me as the powerful god I am. I will then start massacring everyone on Del Playa Street. I'll pull up next to house parties and fire bullets at everyone partying on the front yard. I'll specifically target the good-looking people and all of the couples. After I've destroyed a house party, I will continue down Del Playa, destroying everything and everyone. When I see the first police car come to their rescue, I will drive away as fast as I can, shooting and ramming anyone in my path until I find a suitable place to finally end my life. Eventually, Elliot Rogers chose Friday, May the 23rd, 2014, for his day of revenge. The day before, Elliot recorded his last YouTube video. In it, like in his other videos, he's extremely smug and acting like some sort of Marvel supervillain. It would be pathetic if it wasn't for the fact this man was fully willing to end the lives of others due to his own inadequacies.
Hi, Elliot Roger here. Well, this is my last video. It all has to come to this. Tomorrow is the day of retribution. The day in which I will have my revenge against humanity, against all of you. For the last 8 years of my life, ever since I've hit puberty, I've been forced to endure an existence of loneliness, rejection, and unfulfilled desires, all because girls have never been attracted to me. Girls gave their affection and sex and love to other men, but never to me. I'm 22 years old, and I'm still a virgin. I've never even kissed a girl. I've been through college for 2.5 years, more than that actually, and I'm still a virgin. It has been very torturous. College is the time when everyone experiences those things such as sex and fun and pleasure. But in those years, I've had to rot in loneliness. It's not fair. You girls have never been attracted to me. I don't know why you girls aren't attracted to me, but I will punish you all for it. It's an injustice, a crime, because I don't know what you don't see in me. I'm the perfect guy. And yet you throw yourselves at all these obnoxious men instead of me, the supreme gentleman. I will punish all of you for it. On the day of retribution, I am going to enter the hottest sorority house of UCSB. And I will slaughter every single spoiled, stuck-up, blonde slut I see inside there. All those girls that I've desired so much, they would have all rejected me and looked down upon me as an inferior man if I ever made a sexual advance towards them, while they throw themselves at these obnoxious brutes. I'll take great pleasure in slaughtering all of you. You will finally see that I am, in truth, the superior one, the true alpha male. Yes. After I've annihilated every single girl in the sorority house, I'll take to the streets of Isla Vista and slay every single person I see there. All those popular kids who live such lives of hedonistic pleasure while I've had to rot in loneliness for all these years. They've all looked down upon me every time I tried to go out and join them. They've all treated me like a mouse. Well, now, I will be a god compared to you. You will all be animals. You are animals, and I will slaughter you like animals. I'll be a god, exacting my retribution from all those who deserve it. And you do deserve it, just for the crime of living a better life than me. All you popular kids, you've never accepted me, and now you'll all pay for it. Girls, all I've ever wanted was to love you and to be loved by you. I wanted a girlfriend. I've wanted sex. I've wanted love, affection, adoration. But you think I'm unworthy of it. That's a crime that can never be forgiven. If I can't have you, girls, I will destroy you. You denied me a happy life, and in turn, I will deny all of you life. It's only fair. I hate all of you. Humanity is a disgusting, wretched, depraved species. If I had it in my power, I would stop at nothing to reduce every single one of you to mountains of skulls and rivers of blood. And rightfully so. You deserve to be annihilated. And I'll give that to you. You never showed me any mercy, and so I will show you none. You forced me to suffer all my life, and now I'll make you all suffer. I've waited a long time for this. I'll give you exactly what you deserve, all of you. All you girls who rejected me and looked down upon me and, treated me like scum while you gave yourselves to other men. And all of you men for living a better life than me. All of you sexually active men. I hate you. I hate all of you. And I can't wait to give you exactly what you deserve. Utter annihilation.
At around 5 p.m. on May the 23rd, 2014, Elliot Rogers stabbed to death his two flatmates, 20-year-old Wei Han Wang and 20-year-old Chen Hong. He also murdered their friend, 19-year-old George Chen, who was visiting, again by repeatedly stabbing him. All three were best friends. George volunteered for a Buddhist organization and often helped elderly neighbors get their mail and take out the rubbish. A former high school friend described Cheng as, quote, the kindest kid, so generous, so giving, always willing to help people out. Wei Han's mother lamented how she could carry on with her life without her son in the world. Elliot then spent the next several hours preparing for the second part of his plan. At around 8 p.m, he went to a local Starbucks to get a latte, and at 8:30 p.m, was seen in his vehicle working on his laptop. By 9 p.m, Elliot was driving his BMW north to the Alpha Phi sorority house. When he got there, he found the door was locked, and sorority members heard loud and aggressive knocking at the front door. Luckily, no one opened it to him. However, Elliot started shooting at young women who were standing outside the building. One survived, but two, 19-year-old Veronica Weiss and Katie Cooper, aged 22, both died. As opposed to the monsters that Elliot portrayed these women to be, they were both exceptional, who were loved and would have made a difference to the world. Veronica was described as someone obsessed with sport and a kind-hearted person. Katie was weeks away from graduating, and a high school teacher stated, quote, she was one of 2,500 students I've taught over the years, but Katie was a standout. Elliot then travelled south, began firing into an unoccupied coffee shop on Pardale Road, and then into the Isla Vista Deli Mart, as shown by this terrifying footage. It was here that 20-year-old Christopher Ross Michael Martinez was hit 7 times and died almost immediately. Chris was a man with aspirations. After graduating, he was planning on going to law school, but he was cut down in his prime. Elliot continued driving south on the wrong side of the road, hitting a pedestrian and firing at 2 others, who he missed. He then shot a couple coming out of a pizza parlor and fired at another woman but missed. Elliot then drove in a loop around a city block and engaged in a gun battle with sheriff's deputies. Elliot continued driving erratically, hitting 2 pedestrians with his car before shooting and wounding 3 passers-by. Elliot then struck another skateboarder with his car that shot and wounded 2 men. Elliot then exchanged gunfire with 3 sheriff's deputies and was shot in the hip. Pursued by police, Elliot hit another cyclist before crashing into the curb. At 9:30 p.m, police approached Elliot's car and found him dead in the driver's seat, having put a bullet in his own brain. Found in the vehicle were his guns and over 500 rounds of unspent ammunition. Elliot's rampage claimed the lives of 6 people, not including him, and injured 14 others, 7 of whom were shot and 7 who had suffered blunt force trauma from being hit by his vehicle. The community of Isla Vista was in shock by the mindless violence that claimed the lives of 6 innocent students. There were, as is often the case after these events, discussions about gun control, with it being pointed out how easily Elliot Rodger was able to gain access to guns. But, as is always the case, nothing really seems to have changed. However, the most sickening part of this case is the veneration of Elliot Rodger after his act of pure evil. Since the dawn of the internet, there have always been unstable and hate-filled people filling message boards with bile. But after the crimes of Elliot, the number of message boards devoted to the involuntary celibate movement, commonly known as incels, exploded, with dedicated web forums being created at an alarming rate. The common theme of these forums? Hero worship of Elliot Rodger, including pictures of his face superimposed on pictures of saints, with him being known as Saint Elliot, and his videos on YouTube enabling disturbed individuals to espouse their admiration of the actions of this coward. Unfortunately, it didn't stop there. Elliot has been cited as the inspiration of several disturbed men who have gone on killing sprees of their own. For example, Alex Manassian, the perpetrator of the 2018 Toronto van attack, which killed 11 people and injured 15 others, cited Elliot Rodger as his inspiration for the massacre. In the UK, 22-year-old Jake Davidson was obsessed with the incel movement and, like Elliot, posted videos of himself ranting about his rejection by women. Davidson eventually went on a killing spree in Plymouth in the UK on the 12th of August 2021, in which he killed 5 people with a shotgun, including his mother and a 3-year-old child, before taking his own life. I'll cover both of these cases in future videos. However, it's clear that the horrific crimes of Elliot Rodger have given a face to a dangerous and insidious movement that has spread across the world. It's enabled potentially dangerous people to be able to justify their internal hate, nurture it, and then project it onto the world as a whole, resulting in the murders of innocent people who have usually never met the person who killed them and have had their lives snatched away from them simply because these weak, pathetic men are unable to accept rejection or the fact that the world does not revolve around them. This whole video has been a profile of Elliot Rodger, but I wish to give my final thoughts and bring everything together. The more I look into Elliot Rodger, the more disturbing and dangerous his case becomes. In my opinion, he was a combination of some of the most concerning personality traits which a person can possess. He was extremely narcissistic, entitled, arrogant, clearly psychopathic, misogynistic, racist, and violent. Elliot expected the world just to fall into his lap, and, as I said earlier, it's fascinating reading his insane ramblings over 137 pages, as there was almost no reference to him actually doing anything about his lack of sex. He never seems to have spoken to any girls, and genuinely seems to think that women should have fallen at his feet, removed all their clothes, and begged him to have sex with them. Elliot's callousness is shown not only by his crimes, but the extent of his plans, which included torturing and beheading people he was jealous of, and even killing his 10-year-old brother just in case he surpassed him one day. This epitomizes Elliot. If he can't have things, no one can. If someone is a threat to him, they deserve to die. I do have some sympathy for the child that Elliot was. Lonely, awkward, and struggling to fit in. At the core of him was a deep, dark hole of insecurity and fear. However, I have no sympathy for the monster he became and his inability to self-reflect and think, maybe why I'm in this position is because I'm a bit of a douche. I should do something about that. No, instead he externalized everything and deemed society as a whole guilty of his failings, and, acting as judge, jury, and executioner, he meted out punishment, even though most of the people he killed and tried to kill had no idea who he was and had nothing to do with his situation. His actions ought to demonstrate his utter cowardice. He killed himself in order to avoid being held accountable for his actions, knowing that he would spend the rest of his life in prison, likely on death row, and he would have lost control. I dread to think what would have happened if Elliot had lived long enough to find a woman to have sex with. I imagine this woman would have quickly become the center of his obsession, with him demanding sex whenever he wanted, and this would have likely occurred, in my opinion, whether she consented or not. I imagine he would have been a stalker, someone who refused to take no for an answer or be marginalized for someone's life. Worse still, an actual girlfriend. I think any woman who'd been in a relationship with Elliot would have been controlled, demeaned, raped, and generally horrifically abused repeatedly, given his perception of women as objects, his underlying insecurities, and his violent tendencies. I've little doubt that if a girlfriend or woman he had sex with rejected him, he would have killed them. Outside of relationships, I think Elliot's words are quite insightful into the fact that at 22 years old, he seemed to think he was the most persecuted human being on earth. This makes me think that he was wholly unprepared for life in general, and that he might have faced many situations in his life, for example losing a job, being demoted, and responded with extreme violence towards whoever he felt aggrieved by. Elliot Rodger claimed to be the victim. However, these are the real victims. He was a pathetic creature whose continued reverence by a small group of equally disturbed individuals is testament to their own delusional thinking, and is not shared by wider society, where this man is rightly reviled. Stephen Port is a British serial killer and serial rapist who murdered a minimum of 4 men between 2014 and 2015. However, he is known to have begun drugging and raping men from at least 2012. He met all of his victims through online dating applications, leading to him being dubbed the Grinder Killer. There are 2 sides to this story. First, the horrific crimes of Port, but also the inaction of the police, which meant that the victims' families were not taken seriously, and they suffered further pain outside of losing loved ones. Port was also free to kill and kill again. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Stephen Port was born on the 22nd of February 1975 in Southend, in the county of Essex, to Joan and Albert Port. He also had an older sister, Sharon. There's little information about Port's early upbringing, but no indicators of abuse, although it's stated that his father had an issue with homosexuality, and therefore Port kept his attraction to males secret from his parents. Growing up, Port was described as being extremely isolated and considered strange by his classmates, and he was frequently bullied. One of his classmates described her interactions with Port, stating, quote, "He was quiet, shy, and a loner, who sat on his own in class. The other class members were really not nice to him, and sometimes you could see the hurt on his face when they were really nasty. I was the only one that really talked to him because it wasn't right how he was treated. I told him to ignore them. We weren't really friends, as I myself found him a bit odd." After leaving school at the age of 16, Port went to art college, but it proved too expensive for his parents, and he spent 2 years training as a chef instead. Port was described as a strange man, and, despite his 6'5" frame, was extremely childlike, and even in adulthood was immature and liked to play with children's toys. Port lived at home with his parents till his early 30s, but in 2006 moved into his own property, 62 Cook Street in Barking, East London, where he committed his offences and will remain until his arrest years later. It's clear that Stephen Port struggled in the real world due to his awkwardness and general lack of social skills. However, on the internet, he could portray himself as anything he wanted to be and would spend all day, every day online, rarely leaving his flat. On the internet, he claimed to have been a graduate of Oxford University, served in the armed forces, and worked as a special needs teacher in London. None of this was true. Instead, Port worked for 13 years as a chef at West Ham Bus Depot and also did other work, such as door-to-door sales. Similarly, as opposed to being a balding man in his 30s, Port would post numerous pictures wearing a wig, clearly trying to make himself more attractive to other men, but also making himself look younger. As an aside, the television show Celebrity MasterChef had an episode filmed in West Ham bus station, and Stephen Port appears in the background, albeit briefly. This episode aired in mid-2014, so it was likely filmed earlier that year, or potentially in 2013, so before he committed the murders. However, by this point, he was already a rapist, and it must have been strange for everyone involved in this episode, knowing that they were standing mere feet away from a future serial killer. Anyway, it's clear that Paul was a man obsessed with sex, specifically with younger men, and at an inquest of one of his victims, it was revealed that he'd sent hundreds of thousands of messages to men on applications such as Grindr, and his neighbours noticed a revolving door of young-looking men going into his apartment. It got to the point where, due to how young the men looked, his neighbours were concerned Paul was a paedophile. Paul would also use drugs as part of his sexual activities with these men, specifically GHB, the drug originally developed as an anesthetic, sometimes known simply as G. It's known to reduce inhibitions, increase libido, and sexual sensations become much more intense. It's commonly known as a, quote, date rape drug, due to its ability to cause unconsciousness and memory loss, and also because it's an odorless, colourless liquid that can be easily put in someone's drink without them noticing. However, it's also a highly dangerous drug, and in high enough doses can cause coma or even death. Also found on Port's laptop was obsessive viewing of, quote, date rape pornography, where he would watch scenarios, likely simulated, but potentially not, where men had sex with other men whilst one of them was unconscious. Paul would watch hours of this material each and every day. It's clear that Port began to want to replicate this behaviour, and by 2012, had put his plan into action. It's not clear how many men Stephen Port actually raped, but in court, the earliest victim he was known to have attacked was a 19-year-old university student who Port met on Grindr in 2012. The pair chatted, and this male went to Port's flat, describing as being, quote, polite and friendly, and that, quote, nothing rang alarm bells. He was then given a glass of wine and noticed congealed powder in the bottom of the glass and immediately believed he'd been spiked. He then became dizzy and disorientated before losing consciousness. He had a vague recollection of being taken into the bedroom, undressed and raped by Port, but was unable to wake himself or fight back. This male was allowed to live and quickly left the property. It appears he was unsure whether what had happened was real or imagined, but when he got to university, he sought medical advice as he believed he'd been drugged. In January 2013, a man called the police and made an allegation they'd been raped by Port on New Year's Eve 2012, and that he'd done this on several occasions before that. This male said that Port had plied him with drugs and alcohol to the point he was so under the influence he couldn't say no or fight back, and on each occasion, Port had anally raped him. It doesn't appear that Port was arrested for this allegation, and nothing came of it, although an entry was put on the police national computer database. The next victim was a male known only as B in court records. B was aged 20 when he met Stephen Port on a dating site for gay men. B went to Port's flat in Barking in June 2014 and stated that Port seemed, quote, a very nice guy. B was offered a drink and almost immediately fell unconscious. When he woke up, he was terrified and began shouting and screaming for help. Port, rather than calling an ambulance, supported B whilst walking to Barking train station. B was in a terrible state, vomiting profusely and hardly able to stand. When they got to the station, they were seen by officers from the British Transport Police who saw B incoherent, distressed and vomiting. Port told them that everything was okay and that B had just taken GHB. In court, it couldn't be proved that Port had actually raped B. However, even if this didn't occur, it was clearly the intention. In amongst the crimes against these two men, Port also repeatedly drugged and raped a male known only as C. A couple of things can be taken from this. Firstly, it's clear that Port was drugging men at least 2 years before he began committing the murders, with the intention of raping these individuals. This makes me certain he must have raped far more men than we know about, as it's unlikely that a man this obsessed with sex and heavily invested in date rape porn would have such large gaps between his offences. Unfortunately, there were likely significant issues of shame with these victims, who likely could not recall their attacks and potentially convince themselves that any physical injury they suffered was as a result of consensual sexual activity they could not remember. Others may have felt they could not report it for other reasons, i.e. already being in a relationship, or potentially they felt the police wouldn't take them seriously, which unfortunately, given what happened after this point, seems to be a concern well founded. Secondly, the first victim referred to seeing powder in his drink. I think that Port was experimenting with different drugs for years to determine which would be the most effective at disabling his victims. GHB is a white crystalline powder in its raw form, but it's never normally sold this way. Instead, it's mixed with water to create a liquid solution. So whatever you put in the first victim's drink was something else. I think he then switched to GHB because it's harder to detect and potentially much more effective. Lastly, I think that Port saw the attack on B as a mistake, and that due to his screaming and crying out for help, he was forced to accompany him to the train station, and there he came across the police. I think that Port saw this as a close call, and he believed he needed to ensure this would never happen again. He needed to make sure his victims were completely under his control, with no chance of escaping, and he could not risk being caught again walking the streets with someone he'd just drugged. So Port decided that these men would not leave his flat alive. Within days of the incident with B, Port was again on the prowl, and over the next year, he engaged in a campaign of rape and murder driven by his deviant and predatory sexual appetites. Stephen Port's first confirmed murder victim was 23-year-old Anthony Walgate. It wasn't pronounced Anthony. Anthony was 23 years old and originally from Hull, a city in East Yorkshire, but he moved down to London in order to attend fashion college. He was the son of a woman called Sarah Sack, a woman whose grit and determination is central to the eventual downfall of Stephen Port. Unfortunately, Anthony was struggling financially and so turned to escorting to make money. On the 17th of June 2014, he was contacted by Stephen Port, who arranged sexual services in exchange for payment of £800. It should be noted that Port had no personal savings, and therefore he clearly had no intention of paying Anthony. Anthony travelled to Barking Station, where the pair met at approximately 10:15 p.m, and then went back to Port's flat. What happened next is known only to Port, but it's clear that soon after arriving, Anthony was given a fatal dose of GHB, likely in the laced drink, and he fell unconscious. Whether Port raped him whilst he was alive, dying, or indeed dead is unclear. The next day, Port stayed in the flat with Anthony's body and then went to work a late shift. He returned at 4 a.m. on the 19th of June 2014 and, after dressing Anthony's body, dragged him outside, propping him up by a wall right next to the entrance to the flat complex. Port took Anthony's mobile phone so that their communications could not be seen, plunged a small bottle of GHB on his body, and then made the following anonymous 999 call.
Emergency ambulance, what's the address of the emergency?
It's Cook Street. There's a young boy, looks like he's collapsed outside. I don't know.
Outside of which number?
4758.
Sorry?
4758, I think.
47, Cook Street.
Yeah.
What area?
Barking. He looks like he's collapsed or had a seizure or something. He's always just drunk. But yeah.
What's the telephone number you're calling from?
I'm just pulled up in the car. I've got to get my card on the parking.
That's alright, don't worry about that. What's the telephone number you're calling from?
Just before 8 a.m. on the 19th of June 2014, paramedics and the police attended, and it was clear that Anthony was dead. Suspicions were raised almost immediately, as Anthony was in a sitting position cross-legged, with the paramedics who attended believing that if he'd have simply died from a seizure, he would not have been sat bolt upright. He would likely have slumped over. Also, it was clear that Anthony had been dead for some time. It appeared clear that he died somewhere else, been moved, and then posed. In addition, whilst a small detail, Anthony's underwear was on back to front, which his friends said was never something he would do due to being fashion conscious. At a later inquest, it appears the paramedics did raise their suspicions with the police, but nothing was acted upon. An autopsy showed that Anthony had died from a drug overdose. Sarah Sack was on holiday in Turkey when her son died, and she rushed back to the UK when she heard the news. Her contact with the police was appalling, with the initial phone call telling her son had died apparently lasting only a few minutes, and it was clear there was no investigation into her son's death. The family liaison officer assigned to her had apparently written that Anthony liked to drink and had, quote, dabbled in drugs, specifically cocaine, something Sarah vehemently denied later. Sarah battled the police for months, insisting that her son was murdered, and she criticised the behaviour of the Metropolitan Police in London. Port did eventually fall on the police's radar, as, although he'd taken Anthony's mobile, they were able to trace the number of the phone that made their 999 call. Also, Anthony had told a friend where he was going and who he was meeting. This led to Stephen Port being arrested on the 26th of June 2014. At this point, Port's story magically changed. Anthony had been in his property and they had arranged money for sex, but Anthony had then taken GHB in front of him and died. Port said, due to panicking, he dragged him outside, propped him up, and then called 999. Alarm bells should have been ringing. Port was clearly lying to the police on at least one occasion. Also, there was the fact that Anthony had been dead for some time when he was found. He also had no history of using GHB, and if anyone had bothered to look into Port, they would have seen an allegation of rape against a male using drugs in 2012. However, none of this was done, and Port was only charged with perverting the course of justice due to making false reports to the police, and he was released on bail. Another major mistake was that police seized Port's laptop, but it was not examined for 10 months. If it had been checked before, they would have found multiple searches for date rape porn. Within 5 weeks, and while still on bail, Port committed his second murder. Gabriel Kovari was aged 22 and born in Slovakia, but moved to the UK in June 2014 for a better life. I was hoping to work for the NHS as a translator. Despite only being in the UK for less than 2 months, Gabriel saw the best and unfortunately the worst in people. He originally met a man called John Pape in July 2014. The pair developed a friendship as opposed to a relationship, and Gabriel moved in with him. Although their friendship only lasted 6 weeks, the pair became close. John was upset when on the 23rd of August 2014, Gabriel moved out, having told him he'd met a man online who'd offered him a place to stay. This man was Stephen Port. It's clear that Port had sexual intentions towards Gabriel as soon as he moved in, with him sending a text to a neighbour telling him he should come round and meet, quote, his new Slovakian twink flatmate, and that he was, quote, taking good care of him, suggesting there was more than just friendship going on between the pair. However, it appears that Gabriel soon regressed his decision, as he was not attracted to Port and had been sleeping on the sofa, but knew that Port would try to get him into bed. Sometime after 5 AM, on the 25th of August 2014, Stephen Port administered a fatal dose of GHB in order to rape Gabriel. Port then took to covering his tracks, including using a false identity online, contacting Gabriel's friends, telling them that Gabriel had left the country. By chance, later in the day on the 25th of August 2014, Port's sister rang and later stated in court that her brother was distressed because there was a dead young man in his room. Port, the pathological liar that he appears to have been, later stated in court that the dead young man that he referred to in the conversation with his sister was Anthony Walgate, who had died over a month before, and that he was apparently having some sort of flashback. Absolute bollocks. Gabriel's body remained in the flat for some time, clearly whilst Port tried to figure out his next move. In the early hours of the 28th of August 2014, Port transported Gabriel's body, likely wrapped in a bedsheet, to St Margaret's churchyard, approximately 500 metres away from his home. He then placed Gabriel against a wall in a sitting position. Port posed him, placing a pair of sunglasses on his face so someone who saw him at a distance would think he was just asleep. At around 6 a.m. that day, so a few hours later, a woman called Barbara Denham was walking her dogs past a graveyard where she saw a young man sat up against a wall who she thought was asleep. She called out, but there was no response. She then went up to him and touched him, and concerned that he may have been dead, called the police. Again, a bottle of GHB had been plastered on Gabriel's body. Police attended, and it was clear that Gabriel was dead. For some inexplicable reason, the death was determined to not be suspicious, with them assuming that Gabriel had accidentally taken a fatal dose of GHB and simply died where he was found. No post-mortem was conducted, and Gabriel's body was released to his family overseas for burial. John Pate was informed of the death of his friend and was in shock. He had no indication that Gabriel was a drug user, and he raised his concerns about the conclusions drawn by the police. He pointed out the similarities between the death of Gabriel and Anthony Walgate. Specifically, how strange it was that two young men should die of an overdose of the same drug within 500 meters of each other in less than 2 months. The police ignored his concerns. The police also stonewalled Sarah Sack, who was still trying to be heard about her son. She too had heard about the death of Gabriel and was convinced that there was a link to her son's death. Of course, she was correct. But she was ignored. So Stephen Port was in the clear and free to kill again and to claim his third victim. Daniel Whitworth was a 23-year-old chef who had his whole life ahead of him. He lived with his partner, but unfortunately was also using dating websites for gay men. And on the 18th of September 2014, he travelled to Barking train station and met with Port, and the pair went back to his flat. Sometime over the next few hours, Daniel was administered with a fatal dose of GHB and raped. Whilst Daniel lay dead in the property, Port began to cover his tracks. He deleted his dating profile and wrote an apparent suicide note, which he then planted on Daniel's body before, under the cover of darkness on the evening of the 19th of September 2014, he took Daniel's body to the same graveyard where he'd dumped Gabriel's remains. The next morning, a dog walker found his body. Not just any dog walker, Barbara Denham, the same woman who found the body of Gabriel a month before. She later reported her utter disbelief at being confronted by the same situation again. She approached Daniel's body, which was again propped up against the wall, touched his stomach, felt that he was cold, and then called the police for a second time, saying she'd found a body. The body of Daniel was literally 5 feet away from the spot where Gabriel's body had been found. Police attended and determined there was nothing that could be done for Daniel. Again, he was found with a bottle of GHB on him, but if they bothered to check, they would have found Port's DNA on his jacket from where he'd been redressed after being murdered. They also found an apparent suicide note, which read, quote, "I'm sorry everyone, mostly to my family, but I can't go on anymore. I took the life of my friend, Gabriel Klein. We was just having some fun at a mate's place, and I got carried away and gave him another shot of G. I didn't notice while we was having sex, he had stopped breathing. I tried to get him to start breathing again, but it was too late. It was an accident, but I blame myself for what happened. I didn't tell my family I went out. I know I would go to prison if I went to the police. I can't do that to my family, and at least this way, I can at least be with Gabriel again. I hope he will forgive me. By the way, please do not blame the guy I was with last night. We only had sex, then I left. He knows nothing of what I've done. I've taken what G I have left with sleeping pills, so if these kill me, it's what I deserve. Feeling dizzy now, as took 10 minutes ago, so hoping you understand my writing. I dropped my phone on my way here, so it should be in the grass somewhere." This whole situation, but especially the note, should have been a massive red flag. Firstly, you have 3 young men, all found dead within 500 meters of each other, 2 of them mere feet apart, in the space of 2 months. None of whom were known to be regular users of GHB. If proper checks had been done, they would have found it odd that Daniel apparently was so bereft at killing his good friend Gabriel that he got his surname wrong, calling him Klein instead of Kavari. Also, they would have found the whole situation very odd, considering that Daniel had never even met Gabriel, and there was no evidence they even knew of each other's existence. Also was an oddly phrased suicide note, with the man apparently in the throes of grief and utter despair that he'd taken the life of his friend, but he takes time to mention the man he just had sex with and says not to blame him. Blame him for what? Why even mention that at all? Clearly mention of sexual activity between Gabriel and Daniel in this note was to make the police think that any evidence of this would be explained. In addition, if they'd bothered to check the phone records of Gabriel and Daniel, they would have seen they were nowhere near each other on the date that Gabriel died. Clearly, Stephen Port thought he was very clever, trying to pin Gabriel's murder on Daniel, but this note is amateur hour for the reasons I've mentioned, and this should have launched a major investigation due to the overwhelming evidence that a serial killer was operating in the area. But nothing happened. Sarah Sack was still fighting for justice for her son, but was also now fighting for the families of both Gabriel Kavari and Daniel Whitworth. The families united and continued to put pressure on the police to take things seriously and actually investigate crimes, but they were all ignored. However, there is shocking evidence of very underhanded tactics employed by the police. In particular, in the case of Daniel's death, police records claim that the handwriting in the suicide note was confirmed as being a match to Daniel by his family, something they stated never happened. So the police chalked his death up to a suicide and made no attempts to investigate further. Stephen Port apparently did not kill again for a year, but he continued to drug and rape other men. He attacked at least 3 men, known as males D, E and F. Male D was extremely vulnerable. He met Port in January 2015 and had his drink spiked to his flat and was then raped. Port filmed the rape, then showed it to D, who was obviously horrified. At this point, there's a gap of a few months in Port's offending, but this is only because he finally went to court for perverting the court of justice related to the death of Anthony Walgate. On the 23rd of March 2015, Port was sent to prison for 8 months for this offence. The court had no idea the man they were sending down for this simple offence had killed at least 2 people and raped multiple men. Port was released on June the 4th, 2015, and within a month had attacked another man. This was E, who was 35 years old and who met Port on Grindr in July 2015. By this point, Port appears to have been experimenting with different ways to drug men, and so, when the pair were at his flat, Port used a syringe to inject drugs straight into the anus of E. E felt a burning, painful sensation and immediately knew something was wrong. He got up, dressed, and left. Male F was already known to Port, and they reconnected via Grindr in September 2015. Again, F went to his flat, but he made it clear he did not wish to do any drugs. Under the pretense of applying lubrication, Port again injected drugs directly into F's anus. He felt a burning sensation and started to feel lightheaded, but luckily did not fall unconscious and was able to escape. Why Port let these men live is unclear, but I think that even he knew that he got away with things up to this point and that he couldn't risk having another dead body on his hands. However, his murderous impulses took over and he would claim another victim soon afterwards. Jack Taylor was a 25-year-old man who lived with his parents in Dagenham and worked as a forklift driver. On the 12th of September 2015, Jack went out drinking with his friends. He then went home and accessed Grindr and began speaking to Port, and they agreed to meet at Barking train station. This haunting CCTV footage shows the pair meeting and walking back to Port's flat, essentially Jack's last walk. I don't know about you, but there's part of me that just wants to shout, telling Jack to stop and go home, however ridiculous that might sound. What happened in Port's flat will never be known for certainty, but it's clear that Jack was drugged and raped and was dead by 7:30 a.m, so around 4 hours after meeting Port, as he then began covering his tracks, deleting the grinder app from both his and Jack's phone in order to delete the messages. Jack's body remained in the flat the entire day of the 13th of September 2015, and when it got dark, Port again carried or dragged his body to the same graveyard where he disposed of his last two victims. He placed Jack's body propped against a wall, again just a few feet away from where he dumped Gabriel and Daniel, but this time on the opposite side of the wall. Port planted a bottle of GHB on Jack, as well as a syringe, and took his phone, dumping it. Jack's body was found by a passerby, this time not the same dog walker as before, and the police were called. Again, stunningly, they appeared to take the evidence at face value and determined that Jack had probably taken a fatal overdose, potentially accidentally. Case closed. Jack's family were informed of his passing and were adamant that something was wrong. They stated that Jack had aspirations of becoming a police officer and so was very firmly anti-drug. It got to the point where Jack's family were doing their own investigation, compiling their own handwritten evidence and sending it to the police. However, they, like Sarah Sack, who was still banging down every door and calling everyone she could, were ignored, with the police stating there was no reason to link Jack's passing to any of the 3 previous deaths in the last 16 months. It appears that Stephen Port was caught by chance in the end. A detective reviewing the death of Anthony Walgate happened to see the CCTV footage of Jack Taylor walking from Barking train station with a male. When this detective looked at the footage, he realised the person walking with Jack was Stephen Port, a man who'd been involved in the case of Anthony. At this point, the pieces finally fell into place, with links being made with all the victims and Port, and his background was properly checked and the content of his laptop reviewed. A new team of investigators were assigned, and finally, on the 15th of October 2015, Stephen Port was arrested on suspicion of 4 counts of murder. He was interviewed the next day, and whilst he didn't go no comment, he gave very little truthful information. I've included the full release clip of the interview, which is 11 minutes long, as I think it's fascinating, but also people who like analysing body language will have plenty of material. If you want to skip it, as I said, it's about 11 minutes long.
So did you have any involvement in the death of the male that we just spoke about a short while ago, Gabriel Cavari or Gabriel Klein?
No, I didn't.
So, were you involved in administering any drugs or poisons or noxious substances to him?
No, I don't administer drugs to anyone or give drugs to anyone. That's done at the party by someone else. The name I recognised, one of the parties mentioned before, was is normally at the parties and deals with administrating drugs.
Who's that, sorry?
Daniel. Recognised him. Sometimes he deals, he hands out the drugs to the guests.
Daniel, this is the male,
yeah,
that we spoke of earlier.
So, it might not be the same guy, I really don't know, but is the only Daniel I know. Well, I mean, I've spoken to him a couple of times at the party, remembering his name. He does, like when I did, Scott would ask him to pick up guys, take them to a party, and he would stay, but he would stay and minister or do out hand out of drugs or whatever, but I would leave, but he would stay.
And did you go with Daniel to meet people?
No, I knew he was doing the same as I was, but I'd see him at that party and had a brief conversation with him about it, but I've never actually engaged with him outside of the place.
Outside of the party?
Right.
And which parties were these?
Scott calls the fat parties.
Scott's parties? Yeah. The fat party?
Fat party, F-R-A-T.
Frat parties? So when was the first occasion that you met the person that you're talking of, someone that you know as Daniel?
I think I was on the first few occasions I was there. It was the first time I photographed for Scott, and Daniel was there. So I don't even know if it is the same Daniel I was talking about, but it's the only Daniel I can recall as such. Remember, I think his name was Whitworth. It rings a bell, but
you think his name was Whitworth?
Yeah. I mean, if he's tall, almost as tall as me, with brown hair, slim.
Might help if I show your picture. We'll call this CRT. See, this is Jack Taylor. Do you recognise that mate?
No. No, I just don't recognise him. I don't pay full attention to the guys' faces when I have paid attention to the parties. But I don't recognise his face.
So you don't recognise his face?
I do not know. No.
And I mean, that's Jack Taylor. So you don't recognise?
No, I don't.
Jack Taylor.
No.
So, have you ever slept with this male?
No.
Had sexual intercourse with him?
It doesn't look like the type I'd go with myself.
He's not the sort of person you'd go for?
No, I tend to it's more younger, drinky boys, more younger boys, but not. He looks older. He could be similar to the type I've taken to parties, but I don't recognise him as being one of them.
So you don't recognise him as being one of them?
No.
No. Okay. And Jack, again, was found dead. It was on the 14th of September 2015. Stephen, did you have any involvement in his death?
I did not know, no.
Did you kill Jack Taylor?
I did not know. No.
Did you administer any drugs or noxious substances to him?
I did not know.
With the intention of causing him harm?
No. Definitely not, no.
No. And you say you've never seen him before? Is that right?
That's right.
That's right. Okay, I've got another map here, CRT8. I'm just trying to show you as many maps of the area because it's not easy to get it all on one piece of paper, just so that we're clear really. And again, it shows your home address and it shows the church St Margaret, and behind it you've got the abbey and the primary school. in particular the area around the walls of the Abbey. Have you ever had any reason to go into that area?
No.
Have you ever been through into the Abbey?
No, I haven't. No. No, I don't generally go to the church areas. No. No. I think I once went to that church with my ex Danny. Went to the church on a Christmas day. Went into the church, but that's as far as I got. As far as
You've not been into the grounds behind it, where you've got the old Abbey walls.
No,
the grounds there.
No, it's a spooky, so I won't go there.
You've never been in that.
No.
In all the 8 years that you've lived across the road from the park.
No. I thought it was all private. I wouldn't go there. I think it's private area. It belongs to the church.
It's fairly open, isn't it, when you go past? Would you agree with that or not?
Well, the field's, the field is, but the church bit behind the walls, we won't go past there.
Because 3 of the 4 people that have been found dead were found slumped up against the wall here of the Abbey. Pardon?
Yeah, I didn't know that.
You didn't know that? So that's news to you, is it? Did you put them there?
No.
So obviously Anthony was found slumped outside your address with a large amount of GHB in his system. The other 3 men we've been discussing were all found over by the wall area of the Abbey. We can see on the map. Again, all of them were slumped against the wall with a large amount of GHB in their body. Can you account for that at all?
No, I can't.
I mean, Stephen, did you write this letter? Yeah, CRT 11.
No, I didn't.
The photos of it that's found with Daniel. Are you telling us the truth, Stephen?
I am telling you the truth, yes.
About the letter?
Yes. 100% truth.
About all of these boys?
Yeah.
Young boys? In the early stages of their youth, really, in terms of in their early 20s. All found dead. Stephen?
Yeah, I understand, but...
Close to your house. One of them had been in your house, either just before or at the time when he died, and was found to have large quantities of a drug in his system. The other 3 were all found just over the road in the churchyard, or just beside the churchyard in that area that we've discussed, propped up against a wall, short distance from your house, all again with high levels of GHB in them, enough to kill them. Highly unusual way to die for one person. This is 4 all found very close to where you live. All men, young men, type of men that you say that you find attractive. All now dead, Stephen.
As it happened, Anthony, I know nothing about the other 3, how they come to be.
Stephen, this is serious.
Yes, I know.
Okay. It's really important that you tell us the absolute truth.
told you so far is true.
Stephen Port pleaded not guilty to all offences and, in October 2016, went on trial at the Old Bailey in London. Port tied himself in knots, and his claims changed rapidly, with him saying that he didn't know the victims, to admitting that he did, and then saying that they were in his flat and that apparently all of them had taken overdoses of GHB in front of him. The court did not believe him, and Stephen Port was found guilty of the murders of Anthony Walgate, Gabriel Cavari, Daniel Whitworth, and Jack Taylor. He was also found guilty of drugging with the intention of raping, or actually raping, 7 men between 2012 and 2015. On the 25th of November 2016, Stephen Port was set for sentencing before Mr. Justice Openshaw, who, whilst running through Port's long list of offences, stated, quote, "Self-evidently, the defendant is highly dangerous." He then sentenced him. Justice Openshaw stated, quote, "I had no doubt that the seriousness of the offending is so exceptionally high that the whole life order is justified. Indeed, it is required. The sentence therefore upon the counts of murder is a sentence of life imprisonment. A decline to set a minimum term. The result is a whole life sentence, and the defendant will die in prison. Therefore, Stephen Port joined the list of prisoners in the UK who will never be released. To this day, he continues to maintain his innocence for his offences." After Stephen Port was caught, and due in large part to the victims' families, the Metropolitan Police referred itself to the Independent Office for Police Conduct, the IOPC, and an investigation was launched. The police looked at the involvement of 17 officers involved in Stephen Port's case and found that 9 had demonstrated performance which had, quote, "fallen below the standard required." They were reprimanded for, quote, "performance failings, but allowed to remain in service." And, to add insult to injury, in 2021, the Metropolitan Police confirmed that 5 of these officers had been promoted. The coroner's inquest stated that inaction in the investigation of Anthony Walgate's death, quote, "probably contributed to the deaths of the other 3 men." In June 2022, the IOPC stated they would be launching a fresh inquiry into the police's handling of the Stephen Port case, but given that the original investigation took 2 years, there'll be no answers quickly, and by the time a report is published, potentially these same officers will have been promoted again. I think the term "probably" is indicative of British culture, with us being very polite and not wishing to offend. I'll leave it to my viewers to determine what they think, but I would say the police failings definitely led to Port being allowed to kill and rape people after his first murder. All of the victims' families and friends accused Metropolitan Police of institutional homophobia. They also pointed out how inevitably the police would have handled this case differently if the 4 victims had been women. I think it's horrific that the family and friends of these young men had to basically put their grief aside in order to become detectives, because the people whose job it actually was to do this were so useless. Total respect then. So, what could be said about Stephen Port? What was the thinking of this serial murderer? I think that ultimately Port's behaviour was driven by inadequacy. He was a man who had poor social skills, a menial job, and, at quite a young age, was losing his hair. These are clearly things that Port wasn't able to come to terms with, so he had to project lies about success on the internet and walk around with a wig in order to project the man he wanted to be, not the person he was. The internet was his escape. On there, he could be anyone he wanted. He could feel a sense of belonging and acceptance, likely from the thousands of men he interacted with online. It's common for men and women who have significant issues with their self-esteem to use sex as a way to make themselves feel better temporarily. In these moments, they feel wanted, and temporarily they can forget about how they actually feel. Chasing this feeling can become addictive, and it's clear that this was the case with Stephen Port. While Stephen Port is known as the grinder killer, He used around 10 different dating websites and apps and was obsessed with filling his life with sexual encounters, which I think were an escape from his daily life. I think that Port being described as childlike is also a relevant part to understanding him. As a child, we are taught self-control and that we can't have everything we want. Port appears to have learnt neither of these things. However, I think that as time went on, this didn't have the same impact on Port. The high of meeting random men for sex was starting to wane. He needed to escalate his behaviour. Port became obsessed with rape pornography. I think watching this gave him an idea of how to use sex to have control over another human being, and he started to replicate what he'd seen. He also took people's lives, which was the ultimate demonstration of his power over them. I imagine that Port was most likely ecstatic going through the list of men online, thinking about who he could have sex with their level of consent meaning nothing. They were just objects to use and abuse. When he met them, it didn't matter that he had extremely poor social skills, or was very odd, or wore a wig. They wouldn't live long enough to mock him about these things. He was in complete control. Once he had finished with one victim, he dumped them like rubbish, before moving on and looking for more men to drug, rape, and murder. Watching footage of Stephen Port makes me realise just how good Stephen Merchant's performance was in the 2022 series called 4 Lives, which, if you can find it, is well worth a watch. I think it's still on BBC iPlayer. In my opinion, Stephen Merchant perfectly captures the strange, lumbering demeanour of Port, but also hints at something else, especially during the court scenes, the extreme violence and anger. I think deep within Port, despite his quiet and shy demeanour, is a core of anger and violent tendencies which he had no desire to control. Stephen Port is inevitably a psychopath, and, if released, I've no doubt he would keep killing. However, he'll never get the chance, as Stephen Port's life will end behind prison bars. Joachim Kroll was a German serial killer who killed at least 13 girls and women, as well as one man, between 1955 and 1976 in the Ruhr area of West Germany. He was a deranged sexual psychopath who raped, murdered, mutilated, and consumed the flesh of many of his victims. He was eventually caught whilst the body parts of one of his victims was simmering on the stove. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Joachim George Kroll was born on the 17th of April 1933 in Hindenburg, in the former province of Upper Silesia, which is now part of modern Poland. He was one of 8 children. Kroll is described as being a, quote, weak child who was of below average intelligence, with recent estimates putting his IQ at 76, well below what is considered, quote, unquote, average. Kroll was a shy and withdrawn child who was described as a loner who had few friends. He only attended school until the age of 8 due to his learning difficulties, and instead regressed into his own little world in his room. Kroll's father left the family home to fight in World War II, but was taken prisoner by the Russians. And, although it appears he survived the war in a prisoner of war camp, he didn't return back to the family home. Because of the war, the family moved to the Ruhr area of Germany, moving as far from the Eastern Front as they could. Kroll later told police that when he was a teenager, he'd witnessed someone slaughtering pigs, and he'd become sexually aroused by the sight of their blood. Thoughts about strangling, killing, and butchering women and children became the focus of his masturbatory fantasies. It got to the point where he could not get aroused unless he was imagining violence against women and female children. Kroll was a failure with women. He could not speak to them, and, when it came to performing sexually, he could not get an erection, so he became fixated on sexual acts with unconscious or dead partners. On the 21st of January 1955, the only real link Kroll had to society, his mother, died. She appears to be the only reason he did not escalate his behaviour before. Within weeks, Kroll began a murder spree that lasted over 20 years, with his crimes escalating in savagery to the point where he committed acts of pure evil. On the 8th of February 1955, just weeks after the death of his mother, Kroll was in the village of Valstedt when he came across 19-year-old Irmgard Strell, a runaway who was walking along a road. Kroll invited her to go for a walk into the woods. Around 120 metres into the woods and out of view of the road, Kroll tried to kiss Irmgard. She resisted, He then stabbed her 4 times in the neck, then strangled her, before raping her. It seems likely while she was still alive, and then also after she died. He also cut her stomach open, so she was found with her guts hanging out of her body when she was found 5 days later. A large quantity of semen was found in and on her body, which led police to believe they were looking for more than one attacker. At some point in 1956, Kroll strangled to death and raped 12-year-old Erika Schilletter in an area of Germany where the city of Bottrop now stands. It's believed that there was then a break of around 3 years until Kroll claimed his next victim, and this appears in part to him being careful about his offending. He would only commit crimes in certain areas, often with significant gaps between the murders, in order to avoid detection. To meet his need for violent sexual acts between murders, he acquired a number of sex dolls, including ones that resembled small children, as well as a full-size plastic one which resembled an adult woman. Kroll would masturbate while strangling these dolls, and, with regards to the life-size doll, would have his hands around its throat whilst having sex with it. After each murder, he would come home and have sex with his dolls, no doubt reliving the crimes he'd just committed. His next confirmed murder was on the 16th of June 1959, when Kroll came across 24-year-old Clara Frieda Tesma. He came across her in the district of Rheinhausen, near the Grafsby Bridge, over the River Rhine. Kroll stated that he grabbed Clara and tried to drag her into some woods, but she resisted, so he hit her over the head. He then tried to undress her, but she came to and fought back. During this time, he strangled her before fleeing the scene. Police investigated this crime, and a local man was arrested. Unfortunately, other men being considered suspects for Kroll's crimes is a recurring theme. On this occasion, the man arrested, Heinrich Ott, apparently hanged himself in prison. Just over a month later, on the 26th of July 1959, Kroll lured 16-year-old Manuela Nott into a forest outside the city of Essen, where he strangled her to death and then had sex with her body. Due to the isolated location, Kroll was able to spend many hours with Manuela's body, and he masturbated over her corpse. When her body was found, the amount of semen at the crime scene, again they'd investigators believed that she had been attacked by multiple men. However, this crime was different. Kroll later said that, quote, on a whim, he decided to cut pieces of Manuela's body off in order to try and see what human flesh tasted like. He cut pieces off her buttocks and thighs, took them home, cooked them, and ate them. Kroll later stated that he enjoyed the taste and decided to cannibalize further victims in order to save on his grocery bills. This is clearly not true. It's apparent that Kroll got a sexual thrill from eating his victims, and this added another element to his crimes, allowing him to gain even more sexual gratification after the event. 6 months later, a man, likely with significant mental health issues, walked into a police station and confessed to the murder of Manuela. He later retracted his confession, but spent 3 years in prison before being exonerated. After Manuela's murder, Kroll would stalk and seek out women and children who he believed looked, quote, tender, who would provide the sweetest meat. Again, there appears to be a break in Kroll's offending. It did not strike again until the 23rd of April 1962. On this date, 13-year-old Petra Gies was at a fair with a friend. It's believed that Kroll saw her and followed her, then lured her into some woods outside the town of Dinslaken before strangling her with her own scarf, raping her, and then mutilating her body. Kroll removed both of Petra's buttocks before sawing off her hand and left forearm. He then took these home and ate them. The next day, her body was found, and police quickly made an arrest, a local man who had a previous history of sex offences. He was tried, convicted, and sent to prison for 12 years, eventually serving 6 before he was released. On the 4th of June 1962, 13-year-old Monika Taffel was walking to school in the Duisburg district of Walsum. Unfortunately, Kroll was also in the area, looking for someone to kill and eat. Kroll approached Monika when she was on an isolated stretch of road and dragged her into a rye field. He strangled her to death before masturbating over her corpse. He then cut meat from her buttocks and her thighs. When Monika did not return home from school, her frantic parents called the police, who launched an extensive search, including use of a police helicopter. Her broken body was seen from the air, and officers went and recovered her remains. It was noted that the pieces of meat cut from her body were around the size of steaks. Again, a local man was arrested, 34-year-old Walter Quicker, but he was soon released. However, his neighbours thought he was guilty, and he lost everything as a result of his arrest. In October 1962, he went into some nearby woods and hanged himself. Victim 7 was 12-year-old Barbara Bruder, who was abducted by a Kroll on the 3rd of September 1962 as she walked from her home to a playground in Lutzenkirchen. Kroll strangled her to death, then had sex with her corpse. Her body was never found. On the 2nd of August 1965, Kroll was lurking around a lover's lane in Grossenbaum when he came across a car containing 25-year-old Hermann Schmitz and Marion Wien. Some reports say the pair were just sitting in the car. Others state that Kroll watched the pair have sex. Regardless, he snuck up on the vehicle and used a knife to deflate one of the tyres. Hermann got out to investigate and was promptly attacked, being stabbed in the heart. Clearly, Kroll's main target was Marion, but she was able to fend him off, get behind the wheel of the car, and drive away. Hermann was Kroll's only male victim. Likely worrying he'd be caught, Kroll went to ground and did not kill again for a year. His next victim was 20-year-old Ursula Rowling, who, on the 13th of September 1966, was at an ice cream parlour in the town of Marl. Kroll saw her and waited for her to leave, which she did at 7 p.m. He then followed her, and when she took a shortcut through a park to get home, he attacked. Kroll described killing Ursula as follows, quote, "I saw this woman in the park. She was young, with short hair. I spoke to her and then grabbed her around the neck with my right arm. I dragged her into the bushes and threw her on the ground. I choked her until she stopped moving. Then I took off her pants and her other things, and I did it to her. I left her lying there and took the train back to Duisburg. When I got home, I was still hot, and I had it with the doll, and did it with my hand a couple of times." A local man was arrested and questioned about the murder. He was innocent, but tried and convicted in the court of public opinion, and he subsequently committed suicide by drowning himself. 3 months later, on the 2nd of December 1966, Kroll attacked 5-year-old Iona Haag in the city of Wuppertal. Instead of strangling her, he drowned her in a river, stating what is know what it was like to see someone die by drowning. He then raped her corpse and cut meat from her buttocks, shoulders, and thighs, which he took home and ate. Kroll was becoming more confident and more arrogant, and he began to offend closer and closer to Ho, and even target people known to him. In 1967, he settled in the town of Grafenhausen and began to befriend the local children, who called him, quote, uncle. On the 22nd of June 1967, he lured one of these children into a field and showed them pornography, hoping they would become sexually aroused. When they did not, and they ran away screaming, Kroll chased this child and began to choke her. But at this point, the siren for the change of shift as local man went off, so the area was swarming with workers. So, he left this child and scurried away. He moved out of the area the next day to avoid questions from the police, but the child's parents would not report this incident 2 years later, after Kroll's capture. On the 22nd of June 1967, Kroll killed his oldest victim, 61-year-old Maria Hetgen. Kroll came across her whilst he was walking on the banks of Lake Baldini. He stated later he got a, quote, tickling feeling all over and went to speak to her. She declined to engage. He then hit her over the head, dragged her into some bushes, strangled, and raped her. Kroll began killing again in 1970, but only claimed one victim during this year, 13-year-old Jutta Rahn. Kroll followed her off a train at Hostel train station, and in order to get home, she needed to walk through some woods, and this is where she was attacked. She was strangled to death and then raped by Kroll. A local man was arrested and in prison for 15 months for this murder, before eventually being released. Kroll's rampage was finally brought to an end in 1976, but only because of his own stupidity and arrogance. During this year, 10-year-old Corinne Topher was raped and strangled on her way to school in the town of Dinslaken. On the 3rd of July 1976, Kroll's 14th and last victim, 4-year-old Marion Ketter, disappeared from a playground in the Lahr district of Duisburg. This was the same area that Kroll was living in and only a short distance away from his apartment block. Rather than killing her in the open and leaving her body, Kroll abducted Marion and took her back to his apartment. He then strangled and raked her before butchering her body. He flushed her internal organs down the communal toilet, which soon became blocked. Later that day, this was noticed by one of his neighbours, who also used the toilet, and he asked Kroll about it. Bizarrely, Kroll said the toilet was, quote, clogged with guts. Seen disposing of bloody clothing in a bin outside. The next day, police were searching for the missing girl and making house-to-house inquiries, which led them to Kroll's apartment. The neighbour told police about his strange conversation with Kroll and about the bloody items he had seen him disposing of. The police recovered these items and so were instantly suspicious, and a plumber was called. He confirmed that the drains were blocked with human organs, specifically child's intestines, lungs, kidneys, liver and heart. The police went straight into Kroll's apartment, and what they found inside was like something out of a horror movie. In the freezer, they found bags of human flesh, both from Marion, but it would appear from previous victims. On the stove, they found Marion's severed hand, boiling in a pot with carrots and potatoes. Kroll was arrested on the spot, and so, after more than 20 years and at least 14 victims, Joachim Kroll's reign of terror was at an end. Kroll was originally only suspected of the murder of Marion Ketter, which he freely confessed to. However, he then admitted to a further 13 murders, none of which he was a suspect for, and which, as already stated, other men had confessed to and been arrested for. Kroll went into graphic detail about each murder, where he found the victims, what they looked like, and what he did to them. Kroll was taken to each murder site and forced to engage in reenactments to demonstrate what he'd done to his victims. These reconstructions were photographed, leading to, I would suggest, some truly bizarre moments forever captured on film. I assume this was deemed necessary to ensure that Kroll was being honest and was not, like others had before him, making false confessions. Bizarrely, Kroll seemed to think that because he confessed to multiple murders, he would then receive an operation to rid him of his homicidal tendencies and then be released back into the community. Instead, police were able to gather enough evidence to charge him with 8 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder. He was then remanded to prison to await his day in court. His fate was handed down on the 8th of April 1982, when, after a 151-day trial, Kroll was found guilty on all charges and given a life sentence. However, this would only translate to about 9 years, as, on the 1st of July 1991, at the age of 58, Joachim Kroll, the quote raw cannibal, died in Rheinbach prison. He never expressed any remorse for his crimes. I must confess that I didn't know about the crimes of Joachim Kroll before making this video. I'm surprised it's not more well known. Instead, Armin Meiwes is probably the most notorious German cannibal, but I think you'll agree Kroll's crimes were far more horrific and are more akin to the offences of people like Jeffrey Dahmer. However, this unknown case, to me at least, gives me a new profile to work on. So it's clear that Kroll was an inadequate and weak man, one who wanted to approach women but couldn't. I think there's information missing about his past, something about his hatred of women. Potentially, this resulted from his rejection by them, or something else. Regardless, he had fancies about violence towards women, no doubt enjoying feeling total control and power over them, whilst they cried out as he inflicted pain on them, whether this was from beating them or attacking them with weapons. These fantasies speak to the wider motivation of Kroll's offending, to punish, dominate and control. At some point, these fantasies were not enough, and Kroll got dolls to live them out. But, over time, he needed further escalation and began to target people. It's important to point out the sadistic nature of his offending, shown by how he killed his victims, either strangling them or, on one occasion, drowning them. Strangulation is an up-close and personal way to kill someone, literally looking into their eyes while she squeezed the life out of them. It's a horrific way to die. It's like his victims fought, cried, and screamed for their lives while he wrung the life out of them. The same with drowning. He would have held the victim's head underwater and felt them fight and eventually slacken against his grip. No doubt Kroll was sexually aroused during the killing itself, but this was just the beginning. He was clearly a man who derived gratification from every single part of his process. When his victims were dead, Kroll now had a sexual partner who, unlike the women before, could not reject him. He was in total control and could do whatever he wanted. No complaints, no judgment, and he would violate their bodies sometimes for hours. Kroll predominantly targeted children. I believe this was likely for two reasons. Firstly, he was clearly a paedophile, but also, he was clearly not a physically imposing man, and, by targeting children, he would believe that he could overpower them and ensure the kill. The body parts he took, I think, were his trophies. In the short term, he could sit and admire them whilst continuing to masturbate and having sex with his dolls, but then he consumed his victim's flesh. Again, this was clearly sexually motivated. I think he was aroused and got a huge sexual thrill with each mouthful, as it enabled him to relive the crime itself. But also, it could be argued that devouring someone is the ultimate act of domination by a predator and the ultimate act of submission by the prey. He dehumanized his victims to the point where they were just things, just sacks of meat to get his sexual kicks. Kroll never showed any remorse for his actions. In fact, I think his confession was to brag about how prolific he was. He had no empathy for any of the people he killed. This is clearly indicative of his psychopathic personality. But, in a wider context, I think that Kroll didn't see anything wrong in his behaviour. He knew that there were laws prohibiting the acts he committed, so he had to avoid detection, but like didn't understand or care why. I think this is because his whole life revolved around fantasizing about and committing acts of complete depravity, and to him, this was normal. His complete disconnect from the reality of how others saw his behaviour, I think, was shown by him believing that the authorities would simply give him some sort of operation, stop him killing, and then pat him on the head and send him on his way. Absolute madness. Luckily, instead, the authority threw him in a deep, dark hole where he spent the remainder of his days. But this was only the next 9 years, meaning that he served a total of 7 months for each of the murders he committed, and these were only the ones he remembered. It's like he killed many more. Albert Fish was an American serial killer, once described as, quote, the most vicious child slayer in criminal history. And, despite almost 90 years having passed since his death, I believe that he's still a strong contender for this horrific title. The reason for this is that Fish targeted young children who he raped, murdered, and apparently ate. Fish is known to have committed 3 murders, being executed for one of these, but is suspected of killing many more. He was also a sexual masochist, inserting needles into his own genitals for sexual pleasure. There are so many levels of depravity to Albert Fish, which earned him several nicknames, including the Werewolf of Wisteria, the Brooklyn Vampire, the Boogeyman, and the Grey Man. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Hamilton Howard Fish, who throughout his life wished to be known as Albert, was born on May the 19th, 1870, in Washington, D.C., to Randall and Ellen Fish. The dynamic in Fish's household was strange from the start, with his father being 75 years old at his birth, 43 years older than his mother, who was 32. Fish's mother Ellen had visual and auditory hallucinations and was likely suffering from schizophrenia, whilst his uncle was diagnosed with, quote, mania, so likely bipolar disorder, and spent time in a mental institution. One of his brothers was also diagnosed with, quote, mental affliction. In 1875, when Fish was 5 years old, his father, Randall, died of a heart attack, and his mother, Ellen, due to suffering from financial hardship, placed him in St. John's Orphanage, where he stayed for the next 5 years. During this time, Fish reported to have been physically abused on a regular basis, receiving beatings, which he realised he found sexually gratifying. So instead of avoiding wrongdoing, he would break the rules in order to be in these situations to get his kicks. Fish also implied that he saw boys abusing other boys and the custodians harming the children in various ways, both physically and likely sexually in both cases. In 1880, Ellen was able to secure a job and so took Fish out of the orphanage. But by this point, the damage was done. So you have indicators of Fish likely having a genetic predisposition towards mental illness, being raised in an environment where he was likely exposed to bizarre and unstable behaviour, who, at a young age, was subjected to physical violence and witnessed the same, which he saw was a way to get power over others, as well as sexual gratification. Lastly, it's clear he had a propensity towards exploring deviant sexual behaviours and practices. This combination resulted in Fish, from the moment he left the orphanage in 1880 at the age of just 10 years old, devoting his life to absolute depravity and the abuse of others. As an aside, I want to say that human sexual behaviour is obviously on a very wide spectrum, with people getting gratification from a variety of different acts and stimulus. Most of these fit within a list, albeit quite a long list. However, some people move outside of this quote normal spectrum and begin to be drawn to things that are risky and often illegal. For example, those who begin to watch material depicting bestiality, so sexual contact with animals and people. It appears that these people aren't attracted to animals, but it's more the fact that what they're watching is wrong, which gives them a thrill and leads to the gratification. Without intervention, these people keep searching for more and more extreme material and experiences to get the same high again. Albert Fish appears to have been at this stage, i.e. off the scale of normal, at the age of only 10 years old, so you can imagine how bad his pursuit of ever more grotesque acts to gain sexual gratification got over the next 50 years. It began with him developing sexual arousal to the practice of drinking urine and eating human feces when he was only 12 years old, which he was introduced to by a boy of the same age he began a sexual relationship with. Fish would also engage in voyeurism, going to public bathhouses where he would see young boys undress. In 1890, Fish moved to New York City and began working as a male prostitute. He also began to molest children, specifically small boys. Fish quickly developed a specific typology of victim, with him targeting those who had learning disabilities or African American children, because he believed that these individuals would be less likely to tell the authorities and be less likely to be believed. Fish would lure them to his house, torture them for hours, often with a paddle covered in nails, rape them, and initially release the children alive. In 1898, Albert Fish married a woman called Anna Mary Hoffman. This was an arranged marriage, and I have no doubt set up to try and offset the rumours that would inevitably have been swirling around about his lifestyle. However, this marriage ended in 1917 when Anna ran off with another man, leaving Fish alone with their 6 children. During the marriage, and after Anna had left, he got his children to beat him on the bottom with the paddle covered in nails, which he used on other children, until he bled. He'd also taken to inserting needles into his body, specifically in his groin area. As another form of masochism, Fish would put wool doused in lighter fluid into his anus, which he would then light. Also around this time, Fish showed signs of mental illness, specifically schizophrenia, including believing that he was communicating with John the Apostle. On another occasion, one of Fish's sons describes an incident in 1922 when his father climbed the hills of Westchester, threw up his hands to the sky, and began screaming, quote, "I am Christ." Growing up in this household must have been absolutely hellish. In the early stages of the marriage, Fish did come to the attention of the authorities when, in 1902, aged 32, he was arrested, convicted, and incarcerated for larceny, being sent to Sing Sing prison, where he would be executed years later. However, as the marriage progressed, Fish's external activities were becoming more serious. Specifically, Fish later claimed that in 1910, aged 40, he met a 19-year-old intellectually disabled man called Thomas Keeden whilst working in Wilmington in Delaware, and the pair began a sadomasochistic relationship. At some point, Fish lured Thomas into a farmhouse and claimed that he tortured him for 2 weeks, culminating in him cutting his penis in half. Fish later stated with regards to this act, quote, "I shall never forget his screams or the look he gave me." Fish claimed he intended to kill Thomas, but decided against it, so dressed the wound, gave him $10, and then, quote, "took the first train I could get home. Never heard what became of him or tried to find out." In addition, Fish claimed that in 1919, he stabbed a mentally disabled child in Georgetown, Washington, D.C. On July the 11th, 1924, Fish found 8-year-old Beatrix Keel playing alone on her parents' Staten Island farm. He offered her money to come and help him look for rhubarb in the neighbouring fields. She was about to leave the farm with him when her mother came out and chased Fish away. Albert Fish also claimed to have tried to lure a neighbourhood child called Cyril Quinn and his friend into his apartment on the pretext of eating sandwiches. Apparently, when these children were wrestling on his bed, they dislodged the mattress, and upon finding a knife, small hacksaw, and meat cleaver, implements Fish called, quote, implements of hell, they ran away. Eventually, Fish escalated to killing small children and mutilating their bodies. In chronological order, Albert Fish's first likely victim was 9-year-old Francis McDonnell, who failed to return home after playing catch with his friends in Port Richmond, Staten Island, on July the 12th, 1924. A search was organised, and Francis's body was found suspended from a tree in a wooded area close to his home. He'd been tortured, as shown by numerous cuts to his legs and abdomen, with his flesh around his left hamstring being completely removed. Francis had also been sexually assaulted and finally strangled with his own suspenders before being strung up from a tree where he was found. Other children who'd been playing with Francis told the police they'd seen an elderly man with a grey moustache walking around, mumbling to himself and making strange gestures with his hands. This suspect became known as, quote, the Grey Man. It was only when arrested years later for a separate crime that the Grey Man was identified as being Albert Fish. On February the 11th, 1927, 4-year-old Billy Gaffney was playing with his friends, two brothers who were 3 and 12 years old, in a hallway of a Brooklyn apartment. The 12-year-old went into his apartment, and when he came back into the hallway, both younger boys had disappeared. The 3-year-old was later found on the roof of the apartment, but Billy was nowhere to be found, and the 3-year-old said, quote, the boogeyman took him. A worker on a tram said that he saw a man with a young boy who matched Billy's description. The boy was crying for his mother and was dragged off the tram by the man. Police later identified the boy as being Billy, and the worker later identified Albert Fish as being the man after seeing a picture of him. Billy's body was never recovered, so what happened to him can only be taken from Fish's confession, which he dictated to his attorney after his arrest years later. I'll read out the confession, but please note, it's explicit, and if it's not obvious from the context, monkey refers to Billy's penis, and its peewees his testicles. So Fish stated, quote, I brought him to the Riker Avenue dumps. There's a house that stands alone, not far from where I took him. I took the G-boy there, stripped him naked, and tied his hands and feet, and gagged him with a piece of dirty rag I picked out of the dump. Then I burned his clothes, threw his shoes in the dump. Then I walked back and took a trolley to 59th Street at 2 a.m. and walked home from there. Next day, about 2 p.m, I took tools, a good heavy cat of 9 tails, homemade, short handle, cut one of my belts in half, slit these halves into 6 strips about 8 inches long. I whipped his bare behind till the blood ran from his legs. I cut off his ears, nose, slit his mouth from ear to ear, gouged out his eyes. He was dead then. I stuck the knife in his belly and held my mouth to his body and drank his blood. I picked up 4 old potato sacks and gathered a pile of stones. Then I cut him up. I had a grip with me. I put his nose, ears and a few slices of his belly in the grip. Then I cut him through the middle of his body, just below his belly button. Then through his legs, about 2 inches below his behind. I put this in my grip with a lot of paper. I cut off the head, feet, arms, hands, and the legs below the knee. This I put in sacks, weighed with stones, tied the ends, and threw them into the pools of slimy water you'll see all along the road go to North Beach. Water is 3 to 4 feet deep. They sank at once. I came home with my meat. I had the front of his body I liked best, his monkey and peewees and a nice little fat behind to roast in the oven and eat. I made a stew out of his ears, nose, piece of his face and belly. I put onions, carrots, turnips, celery, salt and pepper. It was good. Then I split the cheeks of his behind open, cut off his monkey and peewees, and washed them first. I put strips of bacon on each cheek of his behind and put it in the oven. Then I picked 4 onions, and when the meat had roasted about a quarter of an hour, I poured about a pint of water over it for gravy and put in the onions. At frequent intervals, I basted his behind with a wooden spoon so the meat would be nice and juicy. In about 2 hours, it was nice and brown, cooked through. I never ate any roast turkey that tasted half as good as his sweet, fat little behind did. I ate every bit of the meat in about 4 days. His little monkey was as sweet as a nut, but his peewees I could not chew. Threw them in the toilet. As Billy's remains were never found, none of Fish's claims could actually be verified. On May the 25th, 1928, Albert Fish saw a classified advert in the Sunday edition of the New York World that read, quote, "Young man, 18, wishes position in country, Edward Budd, 406 West 15th Street." 3 days later, Fish, on the 28th of May 1928, travelled to the Budd family residence and claimed to be a farmer called Frank Howard who could hire Edward and a friend of his. Fish later stated that his intention was to abduct and mutilate Edward, then leave him to bleed to death. Fish left saying he would send for the boys in the next few days, but this didn't happen. He sent a handwritten note to the Budd family apologising and stating that he would soon return. When Fish did return, on the 3rd of June 1928, the family invited him in for lunch, and during this visit, he spotted Edward's younger sister, Grace, who was just 10 years old. Fish stated that he would take Edward and his friend on at the farm, but first he was going to a birthday party and asked if Grace would like to come. The family saw no issue with this genial, 58-year-old, grey-haired man that was apparently going to help them get out of poverty, so they made a fatal mistake. They agreed. Grace then left with Fish, and that was the last time she was seen alive. Fish then took Grace, boarded a train, and eventually ended up taking her to an abandoned building, where, unfortunately, her life ended in horrific fashion. When Grace did not return that evening, her family called the police. However, the investigation was hampered because Frank Howard, a farmer from New York, simply didn't exist. As with many serial killers, Fish was undoing what is needed to brag and gain attention for his despicable behaviour. It was in November 1934, so 6 years after the abduction of Grace, that Albert Fish showed his hand. And he did this via an anonymous letter that he sent to the Budd household. This letter is really strange and rambling. It concludes with what Fish stated he did with Grace. I've corrected some of the grammatical errors to make it easier to read, and wish to read the letter in full for a specific reason, so keep in mind the theme of the letter and the absence of religious overtones. This will be important later. So Fish wrote, quote, "My dear Mrs. Budd, in 1894 a friend of mine shipped as a deckhand on the steamer Tacoma, Captain John Davis. They sailed from San Francisco to Hong Kong, China. On arriving there, he and 2 others went ashore and got drunk. When they returned, the boat was gone. At that time, there was a famine in China. Meat of any kind was $1 to $3 a pound. So great was the suffering amongst the very poor that all children under 12 were sold to the butchers to be cut up and sold for food in order to keep others from starving. A boy or girl under 14 was not safe in the street. You could go into any shop and ask for steak, chops, or stew meat. Past the naked body of a boy or girl would be brought out and just what you wanted cut from it. A boy or girl's behind, which is the sweetest part of the body and sold as veal cutlet, brought the highest price. John stayed there so long, he acquired a taste for human flesh. On his return to New York, he stole 2 boys, one 7, one 11, took them to his home, stripped them naked, tied them in a closet, then burned everything they had on. Several times every day and night, he spanked them, tortured them, to make their meat good and tender. First he killed the 11-year-old boy because he had the fattest ass and of course the most meat on it. Every part of his body was cooked and eaten, except head, bones and guts. He was roasted in the oven, all of his ass, boiled, broiled, fried, stewed. The little boy was next, went the same way. At that time, I was living at 409 East 101st Street, rear, right side. He told me so often how good human flesh was, I made up my mind to taste it. On Sunday, June the 3rd, 1928, I called on you at 406 West 15th Street, bought you pot cheese, strawberries. We had lunch. Grace sat in my lap and kissed me. I made up my mind to eat her, on the pretense of taking her to a party. You said yes, she could go. I took her to an empty house in Westchester I'd already picked out. When we got there, I told her to remain outside. She picked wildflowers. I went upstairs and stripped all my clothes off. I knew if I did not, I would get blood on them. When all was ready, I went to the window and called her. Then I hid in a closet until she was in the room. When she saw me all naked, she began to cry and tried to run downstairs. I grabbed her and she said she would tell her mama. First I stripped her naked. How she did kick, bite and scratch. I choked her to death, then cut her in small pieces so I could take my meat to my rooms, cook and eat it. How sweet and tender her little ass was roasted in the oven. It took me 9 days to eat her entire body. I did not fuck her though. I could have had I wished. She died a virgin. However, when he was eventually caught, Fish fluctuated between claiming he had not raped Grace and admitting he had done this very thing. It was the note that Fish sent to the Budd family that led to his undoing. This letter had the logo of the New York Private Chauffeurs Benevolent Association emblazoned on it. The police went to the organization and spoke to a janitor who it was determined had owned this stationery, but he stated he'd taken it to his former home, a room at 200 East 52nd Street, and he'd left it there when he moved out. This room had then been rented out to Albert Fish. Police went and waited outside the apartment door and waited for Fish to return. He initially agreed to go willingly, but then pulled out a razor and tried to attack the officers. He was quickly subdued and taken into custody. He quickly confessed to killing Grace Budd and being the author of the note sent to the family many years after her abduction. Fish directed the police back to the property where he'd murdered Grace, and, when looking in the grounds, they recovered her skull, but almost nothing else of her remains. To cement their case further, Edward Budd, Grace's brother, was driven to identify Fish face to face. When Edward saw Fish, he launched himself at him, screaming, quote, "You old bastard, dirty son of a bitch." Fish showed no emotion, which prompted Edward to state, "Don't you know me?" Fish answered politely, quote, "Yes, you're Mr. Budd." It should be noted that Grace Budd's death was the only one that Fish was ever tried for. He confessed to the 2 other crimes later and did not go to trial, likely because of the outcome of the hearings related to Grace's murder. Albert Fish's trial for Grace Budd's murder began on March the 11th, 1935, in White Plains, New York. Fish pleaded not guilty to murder by reason of insanity, claiming that he believed that God had told him to kill Grace. The utter depravity of Fish was laid bare at his trial, as psychiatrists inventoried his personality and identified a long list of sexual proclivities, which included, and it is a long list, sadism, so taking pleasure in other people's pain or humiliation, masochism, taking pleasure in one's own pain or humiliation, paedophilia, necrophilia, sexual arousal from acts involving urine, eating feces, whipping, sexual arousal from a sight of blood, female genital mutilation, cannibalism, arousal from penetrating the skin of himself and others with sharp objects, for example pins and knives, watching others engage in sexual or intimate acts, as well as exhibitionism. An example of the level of deviancy came when an X-ray was shown of Fish's pelvic area, which showed more than 24 needles he'd inserted into his genital area and his perineum, so the bit between the scrotum and the anus, over the years. One of the psychiatrists who assessed Fish stated he was, quote, "a psychiatric phenomenon due to the number of sexual abnormalities that he developed." Fish was assessed as having a, quote, psychopathic personality without psychosis. So this means that he was a psychopath and so had these traits such as a lack of empathy or conscience, but this was not rooted in delusional thinking. For what I know of this case, I tend to agree with this, as some of Fish's actions blow his own defence apart. Specifically, the note I read out, which was sent to Mrs. Budd, made no mention of any religious motivation to his crimes. It was clearly a note with a particular purpose, to gain further sexual gratification from causing distress to others. It should be noted that Fish had done this throughout his life, sending obscene, sexually explicit letters to women who posted classified ads in the papers, with him outlining what he wanted to do to them and what he wanted them to do to him. Whilst I have no doubt that Albert Fish had serious mental health problems, including apparently declaring himself Jesus Christ on one occasion, it's clear that he was in his right mind when he went to the Budd residence and was able to present himself as a genial, inoffensive old man, hence why the family allowed Grace to go off with him. There's no indication, at that point, that he was suffering from a psychotic episode, i.e. a break from reality. However, that is just my take. To counter, the defence tried to highlight Fish's apparent obsession with biblical texts and teachings. None of the jurors doubted that Albert Fish was insane, but it appears, as disclosed by one juror later, they thought he should be executed anyway, given the level of his depravity. As a result, Albert Fish was found guilty of the murder of Grace Budd and sentenced to die in the electric chair, nicknamed, quote, Old Sparky. In March 1935, Albert Fish arrived at Sing Sing prison in New York to await his execution. He never showed any remorse for his crimes. At just after 11 p.m. on Thursday the 16th of January 1936, Albert Fish stepped into the death chamber at Sing Sing prison and was strapped to the electric chair. It's rumoured that he held placed the electrodes on his body. How true this is, I'm unsure. Fish's last words were apparently, quote, I don't even know why I'm here. It apparently took 2 jolts of electricity to kill Fish, which led to a rumour that the needles he put in his body had short-circuited the system. There's no evidence this is true. Regardless, the execution was ultimately successful, and Albert Fish died in approximately 3 minutes. His body was buried in the grounds of Sing Sing prison. Albert Fish claimed to have killed over 100 people, but authorities believe he killed closer to 10 children. Regardless, it's apparent that he killed more children than we know about. I've been able to find some information on a couple of the murders he suspects of committing. The first is of Yetta Abramovich. Yetta was born in Russia, and by the time of her death, on May the 14th, 1927, was 12 years old, living with her family in New York. On this day, she was strangled and beaten on the roof of a 5-story apartment house at 1013 Simpson Street. She died later in hospital. I've looked into it, but I cannot find specific information about why Albert Fish is suspected in this case, aside from noting that apparently a tall young man was seen in the area and that he tried to lure children off the street before he met Yetta. However, Fish was 57 at this point, so I'm unsure why he's connected. Also, there was no mutilation, which seems to have been his hallmark. The second murder is that of 16-year-old Mary Ellen O'Connor, who was murdered on February the 15th, 1932, with her mutilated body being found in a wooded area in Far Rockaway in Queens. Albert Fish is suspected, as, at the time of her murder, he had a job painting houses a short distance away. I think it's important to not get swept up in the lore that's created around various serial killers for one quite important reason. Most of them are pathological liars. This is sort of understandable to some extent, as in order to gain access to victims and get away with their crimes, they're often skilled manipulators and have a disturbing ability to deceive others. However, it muddles the waters when trying to get a handle on these people. With regards to Albert Fish, he appears to fit this mould, with him being described as a pathological liar in texts I've read, with him changing elements of his narrative as time progressed. He also claimed to have killed 100 people, which is considered unlikely, and was likely claimed to try and increase his level of notoriety. His case reminds me of that of Otis Sewell, who claimed that between the 1960s and 1980s, he killed 600 people, whilst his accomplice, Henry Lee Lucas, claimed to have killed a further 100 on top of that. They were no doubt killers who ended the lives of many, but many of their claims have been disproven. Also, it's clear that Fish got a sick kick out of causing others disgust, including writing sexually explicit messages to women who saw in the classified ads. Much of what we know about Fish's crimes came from his own confessions, with little evidence to back it up. So how much of it can we believe? In particular, I have some skepticism about his claim of being a cannibal. When you read the notes regarding his consumption of Grace Budd and Billy Gaffney, they seem extremely melodramatic, trying to make an already horrific situation even more salacious. For example, the preamble in his letter to Grace's mother about famine in China is completely unrelated to what he goes on to talk about. Also, parts of his letter were clearly determined to be nonsense. Yes, there have been famines in China, but not one where children under the age of 12 were sold to butchers, and you could walk into these establishments and they'd wheel out the dead body of a child, and you could take pieces of meat from them. Instead, I read that some detectives felt that he was trying to set up a defense of insanity in order to escape the electric chair, which obviously didn't work. His case is also different to that of Issei Sagawa and Richard Chase, where horrific evidence was recovered to corroborate their cannibalistic crimes. It's clear that as outlined in court, Fish had a sexual arousal to the concept of cannibalism. Whether he followed through with this is ultimately unclear. Potentially there's truth in his confessions, but this is buried under a lattice of lies, or perhaps these were just the ramblings of an unsound mind. We will never know. However, even discounting the cannibalistic element, it's clear that Albert Fish was an extremely dangerous and predatory paedophile whose whole life was devoted to utter depravity in order for him to get his sexual kicks. Regardless of what he did to these victims' bodies post-mortem, I have little doubt their final moments were horrific, with him using their bodies to live out his fantasies revolving around sex, torture, and pain. Even with this profile, I would agree that he was one of the most vicious child slayers in history. I've no doubt Albert Fish killed many more children than we know about, and his true number of victims will likely never be known.